This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
It's 4 minutes after 10. A very good morning to you. I can't do this every day, as we discussed yesterday, but goodness me, it is becoming almost unbearably accurate, the way that we are at the moment crunching the news together. Two headlines today, which I mean, the first of which I think would have stopped the traffic not that long ago, wouldn't it? Millions of litres of raw sewage were illegally pumped into one of England's most famous lakes. I think I'd challenge that. I think I would say into England's most famous lake. If I say England's most famous lake, what do you say? Well, exactly. England, so you can't have Loch Ness. It's England's most famous lake. After a fault, it's a BBC report into Lake Windermere, where United Utilities have put millions... Do you know, I can't even bear now to look up what their latest payouts were to shareholders and directors, because you just want to hit somebody. Millions of litres. When did the phrase millions of litres of raw sewage become normal in this country? When did the juxtaposition of these words, millions, litres, raw sewage, Lake Windermere? I used to go to Lake Windermere as a child. It's truly one of the shiniest jewels in the crown of the British Isles. And some people at a water company are pumping millions. It's the second time it's happened. So all of these claims about it being extraordinary or we didn't know what was happening somehow. And I'm not sure I've got the resilience. That's the word I'm looking for. I'm not sure I've got the psychic resilience to look into it any further. They're blaming it on a telecommunication failure. So there you go. That's headline number one. Headline number two, the Public Accounts Committee, which is a House of Commons committee consisting of MPs from all parties, has shared its extreme concerns that the Tories will meet its 40 new hospitals pledge. And there is a separate warning from the National Audit Office. Actually, no, these two stories sit alongside. Sky News have knitted them into a headline. Highly unlikely that Tories will meet 40 new hospitals pledge amid warning that the NHS is crumbling before our eyes. So here you go. Which of those two stories is more important? Is it the millions of litres? Millions, not like a few flipping thimbles full or a kettle load, millions of litres of raw sewage being pumped into Lake Windermere, not the North Sea, where there is at least the possibility that it'll wash up somewhere else, but Lake Windermere itself, or highly unlikely. I mean, who here? Put your hand up now if you thought the Tories were ever going to meet their 40 new hospitals pledge. Go on, I'll wait. Come on. No, hand up in the air if you thought ever that the Tories, I think it was announced under Boris Johnson, which was probably all you ever needed to know about its plausibility and authenticity. But how many people honestly thought that the Tories were going to deliver the 40? How did that story evolve? Do you remember? 40 new hospitals. Gosh, crikey. I don't believe you because you're Boris Johnson, but it would be nice at least. And then the next stage of evolution was, when we said 40 new hospitals, what we actually meant was that we might tart up, I believe is the technical term, we might tart up some already existing hospitals. So we might, it's an old hospital, but what we will do to it will entitle us to describe it as a new hospital. In the same way that if you build an extension on your house, you will be living, when the extension is complete, in a new house. That was stage two. Stage three is, it's probably not going to happen at all. And no one is surprised. That's the bit I can't get my head around, and I've written a whole blooming book about it. No one is surprised. What's that you say? Millions of litres of raw sewage being pumped into the... I know Lake Windermere is a tautology. I know that mere is the Anglo-Saxon probably word for lake. But come on, it's 2024. It's caught on, hasn't it? We can all agree that Lake Windermere, as a phrase, as a description, Lake Windermere has caught on, even though it may technically be tautological. It's a bit like the hoi polloi. You talk about the hoi polloi. And actually, hoi means the. So when you say the hoi polloi, you're saying the people. And when you say, which reminds me, of course, of the Beaten Generation, and Mind Bomb, one of the finest albums of my childhood. But when you say Lake Windermere, what you're really saying is Lake Winder Lake, or Lake Winder. But it's caught on. It's too late now, Caroline, you pedant, you insufferable pedant. It's too late now to turn back that semantic battleship. And then you remember Kieran, the van driver, who was one of the first people in 2016 to tell us about what was likely to happen at our borders. He was stuck there last night as 20-hour border delays kicked in. There's a full thread on it on Twitter, which you can see on my account, at Mr. James O.B. He is watching his livelihood crumble in precisely the ways that he told you that it would crumble, while Jacob Rees-Mogg told you everything was going to go brilliantly. And do you know what Jacob Rees-Mogg is doing today? He's calling for Nigel Farage to be made a minister. The men who have been proved wrong about everything continue to tickle each other's toes in public, while the people who have been proved right about everything, like Kieran, watch their livelihoods crumble before their very eyes. And what does the government responsible for all this do today when we learn of 20-hour delays at the border, millions of litres of raw sewage being pumped into our favourite lake, and just unbelievable, isn't it? And the 40 new hospitals that they actually fought the last election on alongside the Brexit lies are never going to happen. What's the government looking at today? I'll tell you. And I'll tell you with a cautious and modest reminder that I suggested yesterday the government had descended entirely into the territory of the lazy 1980s radio phone-in. Do you know the only thing missing now is the death penalty? And I say that so cautiously because one of them will pop up with it next. The only thing missing is the death penalty. So today we must have more stop and search of people, but we're doing absolutely nothing to address poverty. We must have less sex education. I've got some of the detail of this now. They're going to be teaching children about revenge porn before they teach them about sex. That's in the detail of the proposals being put forward. Sex education for children, lazy radio phone-in. People who don't really understand anything ring in and get angry. You say, as the presenter, how will an 8-year-old being abused by an adult know that what's happening to them is wrong if no one is teaching them about what is wrong and what is right? We'll do that at 11. And then we're not doing stop and search today because the third leg of this morning's tripod of idiocy comes from Mel Stride and Jeremy Hunt. And they are telling you that if you're unemployed, it's very easy to get a job. And I want to do something that we've never actually done before. And I make no apology for this, okay? I make no apology for this. I want to know what it's like to lose your job when you're middle class. Because I understand what Mel Stride and Jeremy Hunt are talking about. They're saying that you can just go and stack shelves. Nothing wrong with stacking shelves, but they are talking about how easy it is to get an unskilled job on a wage that is, it's probably even on a wage that is less than they spend on lunch every day. Than they would spend on lunch every day if they didn't have canteens in the House of Commons subsidised by you and me. So the claim this morning is, and they've got all the client journalists out in force today, front page of the Telegraph, Tories tell police bring back stop and search. Front page of the Times is the one about don't teach pupils about gender ID, schools told. And the front page of, where's the one about and there it is again. Front page of the Times again. Jobs are there if the unemployed want them, Minister. We've got 6 flipping months of this. 6 months of them treating our lives like a sort of hollow election campaign. While all of the bad stuff is happening in real time, they're making meaningless pronouncements about lazy 1980s radio phone-in topics. But I did hear, it may have been Nick himself actually, talking about his own experience of unemployment. And it reminded me of my late father. So the question is going to be, and we've been a bit around the houses this morning, so it gives you an better chance than usual to get on air. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need to tell me what it's like to lose your job when you are on, what figure should we use? 50? 50 grand a year? Okay, I've never done this before. What's it like to lose your job when you're on 50 grand a year or more? All right. I know that's more than the national average, but that's of interest to me because I don't know who Jeremy Hunt and Mel Stride are talking to today. The Chancellor and the Work and Pension Secretary claiming that the economy is doing far better than many would have you believe. And the way that they're proving this is by saying that people who are, to use their rhetoric, languishing on benefits could actually go out and get a job in a heartbeat. So I want to do the broad question of why you haven't got a job. 0345 6060 973. That is the broad question. Why haven't you got a job? 0345 6060 973. But I want to know what it's like to lose your job, to be unemployed, if your lifestyle depends upon an income of 50 grand or more. I'm almost frightened to ask, you know. My late father lost his job in 1990. He was made redundant by the Daily Telegraph. And one of the oddest political experiences of my life was talking to him about why he went to the job centre, because I didn't think, and I know this will sound snobby, but I was only 18. I didn't think people like my dad went to the job centre. I didn't think people like my dad went to what he would still refer to as the labour exchange, God rest his soul. And he explained it to me, as he often did, in ways that completely changed the way that I looked at the world. He said, I've been working since I was 15, son. I've been working since I was 15. I've been paying tax for almost all of that time. And one of the reasons why I have been paying my stamps, as he called them, paying income tax, national insurance and the rest of it, is so that when I need it, the system will support me. And he needed to sign on in order to access certain services. And I think it also made things like tax returns easier. You need a sort of status, or you did in 1990. You need a sort of status in which you can function within the system. I don't know what it's like now. I really don't know what it's like now. Thank God. It's just luck and circumstance. So in 1990, my dad went to the job centre, and it helped him out a bit in that we didn't have a photocopier at home, and he needed one on a couple of occasions. And I think he had a couple of classes on technology, perhaps. There were things he was still using a typewriter around that time to write his copy, would you believe? And the internet didn't really exist, so it was too early for lessons about that. I don't know that he was ever going to see a little postcard on the wall in the Kidderminster Job Centre that would have been a job commensurate with his talents and experience. He, as I say, left school at 15. He went to work for the local newspaper in Shipley, a suburb of Leeds, but worked his way through many local newspapers via a route that barely exists anymore and is taken by even fewer people, all the way to a Fleet Street title, all the way to the Daily Telegraph. He didn't work on Fleet Street. He was the Midlands correspondent. And he was a brilliant journalist, about 463 times better than I will ever be. And then he lost his job. And that's all he'd done since he was 15. So the likelihood of there being a job on a postcard on the wall, clipped to the wall, pinned to the wall in Kidderminster Job Centre, that in any way reflected what he had done for 40-odd years, was probably zero. It's the same job centre where I once applied for a job as a trainee sea lion tamer at West Midlands Safari Park. But my dad didn't like swimming. And there were jobs, there would be good jobs, if you know, like payroll and accounts and things that would be considered white collar, but which my dad would have absolutely no knowledge of at all. And that's a specific profession, isn't it? It's a limited profession, but there's also the livelihood. It was my last year at fee-paying school. It was my last year at boarding school. My sister still had 2 years to go. There's a redundancy payoff, of course, but, you know, that is a finite amount of money. It's not like a wage. And for Jeremy Hunt and Mel Stride to say to the 2024 equivalent of my dad that there's plenty of jobs out there if you want them seems to me to be missing almost every single point that I've just made. And it leads me into the Shipley is Bradford. Of course it is. I'm so sorry. He lived in Leeds. He worked in Bradford. Please don't excommunicate me from the Honorary Yorkshireman Society. Good God, I've never had more texts. I've never had more texts about anything in my life than about misappropriating Shipley. Shipley Times and Distress. It was. I know. Sorry. Stop it now. That's enough. Oh, flipping heck. I think the Tories have such contempt for people who have struggled. I really do. And it's the weirdest thing about Tory rhetoric for me, is the inability to appreciate that it could be them. Do you know what I mean? That the simple lesson of there but for the grace of God go I. They just don't seem to acknowledge it. So Mel Stride and Jeremy Hunt, I don't know what Mel Stride's personal circumstances are, but Jeremy Hunt's always going to be all right. If he doesn't even have a job anymore, he's got all his rental properties to live off. But, you know, the idea that you might actually be on your uppers, you might have need of state support. I thought furlough might change the world. In my own naive and foolish way, I thought furlough might make people who thought, well, I'll never need any help from the state. And suddenly I do, and you got it. I don't know. So what happens if you, and I'm choosing 50 grand. You may not think that's the right figure, but you're welcome to you pick your own. But what I mean is that you can't really afford to take the sort of jobs that Mel Stride and Jeremy Hunt are talking about, the ones that are, if you like, there if you want them. So regardless of your status and position, how do you answer the question of why you haven't taken the jobs that Jeremy Hunt and Mel Stride are talking about? 0345 6060 973. But the second question is, if you're earning over 50 grand, you lose a job worth more than 50 grand a year, what happens in terms of unemployment? Because it's one of those things about which you will know nothing until you suddenly need to know everything. 03, and I will not be accepting any more texts about Bradford or Leeds. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. If you hit the numbers now, you will get through.
James O'Brien on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
23 minutes after 10 is the time. It is, the more you read it, a really nasty piece of rhetoric, I think, from Mel Stride and Jeremy Hunt today. If you're going through one of the toughest times of your life and you're worried about even perhaps losing your home, Mel Stride and Jeremy Hunt are here to tell your friends and your neighbours and the people on the school run that it's all your own fault and there are plenty of jobs out there, and frankly, if you're kicking your heels, then it's probably a lifestyle choice. I wonder how that holds as you move into the sort of territory that we might traditionally consider to be conservative voting, and that is why, very arbitrarily, I've introduced a lower limit. There's no upper limit. What's it like to lose your job if you're on $250,000 a year? I appreciate most of us would respond to that question by reaching for the world's tiniest violins. But if you're on $250,000 a year income, gross, and your outgoings are 150 grand a year, i.e. pretty much all of your net income, then what happens when you lose your job unexpectedly? You're never going to get a whip around, are you, or a crowdfunder for a city lawyer who loses their job in a round of redundancies that they didn't see coming. But for them, their life explodes. But don't worry, because Hunt and Stride are here to tell you that there's loads of jobs out there. Victoria's in Richmond. Victoria, what would you like to say?
Hi there.
Hello.
I lost my job while on maternity leave, and I was earning a really good wage, about just over 90,000 a year. I suddenly lost my job, and I have been trying to balance searching for a new job whilst looking after my daughter, who I can't afford to put into nursery or care or anything because I don't have any income at the moment.
Right.
I work in the TV and film industry, which is really suffering at the moment. The Tories aren't really talking about it, but
It's the worst it's ever been. And print media as well, actually. Q magazine closed yesterday. I don't know if you know. It got relaunched about 9 months ago. They were doing a bang-up job, and then they just pulled the plug. So again, asking people to feel sorry for anyone in the media is quite a challenge, Victoria. But we are human too. We are human too.
Exactly, and I know, in general, we are paid very well. But in the past, if I had, lost a staff role, I would have gone on to freelance. And
Yes.
75% of freelancers in the TV and film world at the moment are out of work. That's how bad it is.
So what happens? Well, I mean, where do you go on your first day as someone who hasn't got a job? What do you do?
Well, exactly. What do you do? I mean, I'm just spending every time that my daughter naps applying for jobs, and some of which, I've got 15 years experience, and yet I'm not even getting responses a lot of the time.
And are you registered as unemployed anywhere? Are you receiving universal credit? Are you on the list, as it were?
Not universal credit,
Right.
but I did decide recently to sign up for job seekers for the first time in my entire life.
Yes, but you're entitled to it.
Because I've been paying taxes my entire life,
Exactly.
and because I have a daughter that I need to feed and provide for. My husband is a junior doctor within the NHS. As we know, it's very underpaid compared to every other country.
And very overworked.
And very overworked, and he can't afford to pay my side of the mortgage and his and all of our bills and outgoings.
Well, you wouldn't have got the mortgage on the strength of your husband's income alone, would you? With the calculation. Can I ask how much job seekers allowance is for someone in your position, or not?
It's less than £100 a week, which basically...
What were you on before? What does 90 grand a year translate into as a weekly net income, roughly?
It's about 7 grand a month or something like that.
Okay.
So, I mean...
So £1,500 or more.
Yeah. It's the difference is massive. Like I can basically afford some nappies and some food on that, like nothing else. So we will be looking at, if I don't manage to get a job in the next 6 months, we do have to think about what we're going to do in terms of our house, whether we're going to have to move or rent it out.
I presume you're considering emigration as well, are you?
Potentially, yeah. We might go to Canada or somewhere like that where my husband could get paid a hell of a lot, probably double if not triple what he would get paid here as a doctor.
And the house, when does that? And I hate to do this to you, but I know you've looked into this abyss. When does the house become unsustainable?
Probably in the next 6 months or so, we would have to look at potentially renting it out and living somewhere much smaller. And it's a modest house. It's not.
No, I understand. Big. And when Mel Stride and Jeremy Hunt tell you that don't worry, there's loads of jobs out there if you want them, your response would be?
It's just a kick in the gut. It feels like they are so out of touch with what is happening currently in the job market, in the economy, in everyday people's lives. And it just, once again, feels like the Tories are living in their own little bubble and they really do not understand the struggles of everyday people. And I'm just so angry that people continue to vote for them because it just...
It gets ever more extraordinary. And finally, Victoria, if I may, is this morning the first time you felt seen in your current situation?
Well, yeah, it's the first time I've ever called into a radio show ever because I feel like really passionate about this.
Because you deserve better. And what you're getting from the only people in a position to deliver better, what you're getting is patronising platitudes and borderline lies. It's easy. There's a headline. Jobs are there if the unemployed want them. Nothing to see here. Everybody move along. Absolutely fine. What are you supposed to do? Dan writes, I'd lose if I lose my £68,000 a year job, and I know there are lots of people listening who can't even dream of incomes like Victoria's or Dan's, but we are actually all in there. You lose your job, you're suddenly identical. We'd lose the house, James, the car would go. My wife wouldn't be able to work as a low-paid nurse as she'd need to increase her income. She doesn't make much at the moment, but because I earn so much more, she doesn't have the pressure of having to worry about her low pay. I've tried many times to get her a better paying job, but she just likes to be a nurse. Sounding a tiny bit Victorian there at the end, Dan, but I take your central point. It's coming up to 10:30. Mel Stride and Jeremy Hunt are adamant that if you want a job and you're currently unemployed, then there's loads, which seems to me to reflect the reality of almost nobody. And that, I fear, is how the Tories are going to fight the next general election. I've put together a little list of things they should be looking at. I tried yesterday. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.5 issues on my list. 8.5 issues on my list of things the government could be worrying about when today they're trying to direct your attention to calls for less sex education, more stop and search, and more abuse of unemployed people for being there through a form of lifestyle choice rather than either economic or individual necessity.
James O'Brien on LBC. Listen on your smart speaker. Just say, play LBC.
It is 10:32. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I think we should probably find some room for one of these today.
Unhinged headline.
This is perhaps inevitably from the Telegraph. Britain is paying the price for surrender to the EU. The UK can't control its borders because Sunak did not heed my warnings, writes someone called Martin Howe, on the Northern Irish Protocol. So you now have Brexiters complaining about other people not heeding warnings about what was likely to happen to Northern Ireland. If irony could be distilled and put in a bottle, you'd now have about 14 litres of that. In fact, you'd have hundreds of millions. You'd have more litres of irony in bottles than is currently being pumped in untreated sewage into Lake Windermere, Mere. I got that wrong, haven't I? Lake Windermere, Lake. Anyway, That's today's.
Unhinged headline.
And there might be another one. Also, while we're here, I've got a quick idiot's corner. But Chris, this is for you, mate. And I know that this is very popular on your Uncle Keith's Facebook page, but you are part of the problem the more you subscribe to this sort of nonsense. Why don't you talk about the corruption in the United Nations and the World Economic Forum? Everything that's happening is by design to ruin humanity and create complete control. Control of whom by whom, champ? It's a problem with these online conspiracy theories, is that you get the little shot, you get the jolt of adrenaline. Oh, my God, they're trying to control us all. Who is? The United Nations, I know people that work at the World Economic Forum. The idea, it's a bit like George Soros, isn't it? Or Bill Gates somehow controlling vaccines or controlling the media. It is absolutely bonkers, but the more you believe that, the less time you spend actually blaming the people responsible for, off the top of my head, millions of litres of sewage being pumped into Lake Windermere, a third of mothers on birth wards having traumatic experiences, dangerous prisoners being released early because there's no room and the whole system is in meltdown, shoplifting being pretty close to not even being considered a crime anymore while the police face all manner and of myriad other problems, NHS waiting lists, patient satisfaction the lowest it has ever been, GP appointments as rare as hen's teeth, dentists even rarer, border checks on fresh food, making everything more complicated and more expensive. And if you lie awake at night worrying about such things, immigration is higher than it has been in donkey's years. But hey, you focus on sex education in schools and unemployed people swinging the lead. Because if you need a job, if you want a job, there's loads of jobs out there. Until you actually ask people what it's like to be out there without a job. Ross is in Chipping Camden. Ross, what would you like to say?
Yeah, good morning, James.
Hello, Ross.
Love the show. Don't always agree with you, but love the way you make me think about things and life in general.
I'll take that. Thank you.
So a bit of background. I'm a long-term Tory voter. Won't be voting them again in my foreseeable lifetime, I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
Jeremy Hunt used to be my local MP. And I've had the very privileged background where I went to a public school, not a great one, but a public school.
God, that's such a class-ridden English thing to say, isn't it? It really is.
I know.
That's extraordinary. Yeah, go on.
And I've been lucky that since I was about 25, I've always had jobs over £50,000 a year. I've reached about 130 a year.
Gosh.
My last role was 85 plus. And I found myself, I feel very thankful for that. However, with everything that's going on with the Tories at the moment, I don't think they really get to understand how much of a kick in the, I was going to swear that, but yes. You know where I'm going with that, how much of a kick in the guts it actually is.
No.
We've got houses, we've got cars, we've got dependents and children, and it's really tough. I mean, I've got 25 years industry experience, and I'm not getting callbacks for jobs that I'm probably well overqualified for. Yeah. And I'm quite happy to take the knockdown from, say, an £80,000 salary to 50% of that, or even less, just to keep going. Right. And there are lots and lots of jobs out there. However, if you're a middle-aged man, and I'm 45, you're not getting callbacks, you're not getting phone calls, you're not getting recruitment agencies calling you. The big companies always want the youngsters, they want the up-and-comers because they think they're driven. They know.
Where do you think the cut-off point is? Because I'm 52, so I'm toast as well when
I think
the time comes. But where do you stop being an up-and-comer?
Up until recently, I honestly thought it was going to be 50, 55 plus. Yeah. But what I'm finding is there is a degree of ism, and I'm not quite sure what the ism is, whether it's age-related sexism or, qualificationism, whatever you want to call it. But there is definitely something.
You've got someone who's overqualified. It seems to be against natural justice not to give them the job. But the worry there is, of course, that they'll be looking around as soon as they get there to move somewhere more commensurate with their qualification.
Yeah, and I'm quite happy to go and do something completely different, diversify, as, using some of my farming friends' language, and go and do something completely differently. And I've got cross-comparable skills that would go across many different industries. But because you haven't got a background in, say, construction or power networks or whatever it may be, that the companies just aren't interested. They're so insular. So where do you go? Looking at the government job boards, for example, there's next to nothing on there for a salary above £80,000 a year. Fine, I accept that. It's designed for certain people, certain trends in society.
But you've got your mortgage doesn't. Your mortgage has gone up, or if it hasn't, you're lucky. Your cost of living has gone up, or if it hasn't, you're lying. Outgoings that are not easy but manageable. when the tide is in become completely impossible when the tide goes out.
Exactly that, and that's the problem, is the mental health side of things. Nobody's actually talking about that for middle-aged
Tell me about it a bit. Tell me about the toll.
So I'm currently taking medication for anxiety and depression.
Right.
I have a minor history of it, shall we say, but it's been predominantly since January of this year, through stress of work, then leaving work, then the pressures of being basically kicked out the door. Won't go into details because I can't.
No, that's fine.
And, I have a friend of mine in the same village, and there's probably 150 people in this village.
Yeah.
He's been out of work for 6 months. He's a software sales professional. He's done it all of his life. And we catch up for coffee every now and again, and a slice of cake or a biscuit, whatever's going around. And he is literally on the verge of losing everything.
Yeah.
He's talked to me about he's actually better off dead. And we've had some very serious conversations around this. And, I haven't brought him back from the brink because I don't think he's there, but we've had some very serious conversations. And he needs a lot of support and propping up. And where do these people go? There is no forum for these people. It's not as if we can go down to, to coin a phrase from what was the film in the 80s with the Sheffield Steel Workers, 90s, sorry.
The Full Monty.
The strip, that's the one.
Yeah.
There is no job club for people like us. There is no support. I haven't looked into benefits because I've always assumed there's no point.
So you're not officially signed on as unemployed then?
No, but again, I was raised from a middle class-ish background where
it just doesn't happen to people like you.
It was a dirty word.
Yeah.
We don't do benefits in this family.
Well, that's. I mean, you'll allow me one little nudge. That is a legacy of being a lifelong Tory voter as well, because it is the Tories who created that rhetoric. Because I was the same as you, and I'm not, for the avoidance of doubt, a lifelong Tory voter. But when I was 18, and my father was made redundant, and he went to the job centre, I needed him to explain to me, explain away my shame, and so I'm just stressing that I understand the association of shame with that, but it shouldn't be there, and it's been put there by politicians, Ross.
And there is a huge amount of keeping up with the Joneses, no matter where you are, whether you're in a council flat in Dagenham or if you're in a £5 million house in the Cotswolds or Cheshire. Yeah. You want to be seen to be not necessarily affluent, but successful.
To be doing well. Someone once said to me, the happiest people live in the biggest house on their own street. It doesn't matter where the street is. And that is sad. We shouldn't be atavistic, but we are. It's the human condition. And I have to add this into the mix because I'm on a bit of a roll at the moment with this particular generation of cabinet ministers, because it was Mel Stride a couple of weeks ago who was saying that people like you who are receiving treatment and medication for your mental health just need to sort of pull your socks up and stop swinging the lead. So Mel Stride is not someone you would want to bump into in an alleyway on a dark night for fear of what you might do to him, Ross.
Well, probably not, because I have been personally affected by part of his previous policies in terms of inside-outside IR35,
right? Yes,
and the loan charges. Now, I'm not going to get into that. I've paid the charges, not a problem. My hands up. I should have done more research. Not a problem.
Okay.
However, these guys, they live on cloud cookie land. I mean,
they're telling you today that there's loads of jobs out there for people like you, and it's the second bit of that sentence that is so obnoxious, isn't it?
But the people like it's absolutely bloody offensive. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's fine. I'll allow that.
Sorry, because they're looking at the lowest demographic. They're trying to tar everybody with the same vein of, well, they can all go dig holes in the road, they can all go stack shelves at Tesco's, they can all go and put pallets on forklifts, and yet absolutely everybody in their right mind will do that if we have to.
Yes.
However, what's the point of having 25, 30 years of an industry experience if you can't even get a look in the door?
And that is a rhetorical question. I know it is, and I wish I could be of more comfort to you. I hope just having somewhere to vent has been of use, Ross. I would, as a few people are saying, and I know when you start in this situation, you don't think it's going to last for long enough for it to become pertinent, but I think you need to sign on to get your national insurance stamps paid, which is something else that can come back to bite you on the backside a little bit later if you're not across it earlier. But there it is. The reality, if you like, of being in precisely the position that Mel Stride and Jeremy Hunt are talking about today appears, shock horror, to be absolutely different from what Mel Stride and Jeremy Hunt are describing. Thank you, Ross. Take care. Louise is in Manchester. Louise, what would you like to say? Louise? Let me read some...
Quite
here we are.
similar
Carry on.
to the last caller, really.
Yes. Oh, there's something wrong with your phone line, Louise. I can only hear about one word in 12, which is obviously suboptimal. I can't believe someone else has made this point, because I wanted to make it as well, Adrian. Victoria, our earlier caller from Richmond, is unfortunately a perfect example of what Gary Stevenson is trying to get people to understand. Gary Stevenson, now a best-selling author, but also his YouTube channel, Gary's Economics, talks about inequality not only affecting the poor anymore. The economy is now becoming tilted against people who on 90 grand a year. Natural Tory voters, traditionally, as Ross just alluded to. It's a great text, this, Adrian. This all shows how important wealth distribution is, yet neither Conservative nor Labour are interested in addressing the problem. Gary's Economics needs constant plugging. I'm happy to plug it, but he goes further, and he talks about how epic wealth is now moving onto the middle class lawns. So working class people have been left with next to nothing. Right, I think everybody can agree about that. They're even on 0 hours contracts. The idea that you have any social capital or workplace dignity has been completely eroded by neoliberalism, culminating in 14 years of Tory rule. So where do you go next if your only reason to exist is to accrue ever more money? If you're running a fund, if you're running a bank, if your job is simply to accrue money, a sort of Rees-Moggian approach to economics. Where do you go next? Where is the money? The money's in the middle class. The middle class are next, and what you're hearing today are some of the canaries down the coal mine of that process, which is the next stage of a redistribution of wealth, a post-20th century redistribution of wealth, where the advances made by ordinary working people are undone by the latter-day aristocracy, and that's an aristocracy of wealth rather than an aristocracy of inherited privilege, although it's often very hard to tell the difference.
James O'Brien on LBC.
10:47 is the time you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Razor says, can we have a jingle for Idiot's Corner? I don't know. Some people pick up on me for Idiot's Corner. They say it's a bit unkind. Also, it'd be like the bit of lawn when you step off the patio. The bit of lawn that gets really worn out. It'd be like that, wouldn't it, Razor, if we had a jingle for Idiot's Corner? But some people say I shouldn't have. It's an idiotic corner. So it's idiotic behaviour. I don't want to label anyone an idiot, although in Mel Stride's case, the temptation is almost irresistible. So no, we're not. Also, it takes me months to get a jingle. It takes me so long to get a jingle that I forget about what the feature was before I before I politely and almost certainly in vain requested that somebody put together some actual production for me. Gary Stevenson's book, by the way, if you're interested, is The Trading Game. And I've got a horrible feeling that in 30 years' time, people are going to be a bit like Ross was when he said, I wish I'd understood a little bit more about loan charges and things. I wish I'd read Gary Stevenson's book. As a member of the middle class who thought that I was somehow immune from the vicissitudes of poverty and from the greed of epic wealth, the middle class sort of manages to plot a peaceful course between the Scylla and Charybdis, the Scylla of genuine poverty and the Charybdis of acquisitive capitalism. The middle class homeowner is going to be safe from those forces. And Gary's thesis is very much that we are not. 10:49 is the time. Mel Stride and Jeremy Hunt say that if you're unemployed, get over yourself. There's loads of jobs out there. The ghost of Norman Tebbit telling you to get on your bike, sort of in full flow this morning. What is it like if you're in that category and financially at least a traditional Tory voter, which is why I've introduced the lower limit of about a 50 grand a year income. So anything above that, what's it like to lose your job? And more importantly, what's it like trying to find a new one? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Louise is in Manchester. Louise, what can you tell us?
Hi, is that better?
Yes.
Is the line better now?
Yes.
My situation is similar to I think it was Ross that was before me. Not that I was earning as much as him,
okay.
But I've been looking for work for about 6 months, and I am on universal credit at the moment. And I think the difficulty is I've applied for hundreds of jobs, and like Ross was saying, I don't seem to get even an interview sometimes, or you don't seem to get any response. And even when I have had an interview, I think sometimes I'm in my mid-50s. I think age has a lot to do with it. So, and it's not always about age discrimination necessarily, thinking that you can't do the job or you're not suited or whatever. It's more about, whether you'll fit in with the team.
With the younger workforce.
The role, because, other people might
not be able to. It's a workforce with lower expectations as well. I don't know how pertinent that is, but in terms of terms and conditions and pensions and all the things that older generations took for granted, there's a generation caught between the two, isn't there? That I can see why they wouldn't be top of the list. Talk to me, if you would, about universal credit, because it's gone up a lot just in the figures released today. We know for a fact that a lot of people on it are in work, but you're not. What sort of a hole does it fill in your previous income?
Oh God! Well, because I had some savings,
right?
I wasn't getting the full amount up until I think I'm due a payment this week, in which I'll get more money.
Right.
But it's a drop in the ocean. So I was explaining before, my mortgage is £1,600 a month.
Yeah.
And I'm not living in a massive house. I'm living in a 3-bedroom house.
Sure.
In the southeast, and it doesn't go anywhere near what the kind of money that you need to keep ticking over.
So what happens next? What happens when you run out of road?
Well, I think I've got one mortgage payment left,
right.
And then I'll have to sell the house. And I've even looked at, selling it quickly to, those organisations that will just buy the house without any fees and things like that, or they'll cover the fees.
Look, I mean,
and I won't even get what the house is worth.
Don't make sure you've got your eyes wide open if you go down that road. I know you don't need to tell you that. You just weren't expecting to run out of road. You weren't expecting to run. Well, and what's about? Because I think the next lady we'll talk to was on a similar income to you and has taken a job in Sainsbury's. So what about doing something like that?
I mean that's probably what I'll have to do. But at the moment I've been trying to save my house. That's all I've been focused on. Because I've got a son. We both have to find somewhere to live if I have to sell my house. But what I wanted to say also is that the experience of being on universal credit is very, very difficult. And I think Ross was talking about his mental health.
Yes.
But I have to go in every week to see my job coach for 10 minutes.
Yeah.
I'm always kept waiting. It's no help whatsoever because they don't really understand what it's like to try and find a job when you've been, in quite a senior position. I think they're sort of used to seeing people that are looking for a more junior role. So the advice that you're given isn't really very helpful.
No,
and they don't seem to have the knowledge of what you do need. So, I was messed around with the money because I had savings. They thought I was, trying to, because my...
But it's not designed, nothing politically has felt like, for me at least, and I obviously have the enormous privilege of being on the outside looking in, but I can't remember the last time I heard a politician talking about unemployment as if it were a problem to be fixed by policy and creativity, as if to find ways in which to make sure that we can fit the right people to the right jobs. It's just a stick to hit people over the head with if you're caught in that scenario, and to inflame yet more othering if you're not. So, the response would come from government and indeed from Daily Mail readers cheering on these sort of policies. The response would be, oh, no, I don't mean you. That's why I've chosen today's way into this conversation. Because when Daily Mail readers are encouraged to hate unemployed people, or Today Times readers are encouraged to believe that all unemployed people could get a job tomorrow, they don't mean people like them. No. God Lord, if my son lost his job, I wouldn't want him taking up the sort of roles that Jeremy Hunt and Mel Stride are talking about. So everything is underpinned. I'm going to construct this properly soon. So everything is done as if it's a lazy 1980s radio phone-in show. A couple of you have pointed out to me that not all phone-in shows in the 1980s were lazy. The great Brian Hayes was strutting his stuff on this radio station back then and setting the standards that we all still follow. But lazy radio phone is, aren't immigrants awful? Oh, down with the unemployed. Single mothers, aren't they terrible? That's the government. Today it's, we need less sex education. We need more stop and search. And unemployed people, it's very easy to get a job. So you've got that kicks into it. But then the way that they leaven it in order to keep their own people sweet is by then adding in a little whisper in the other ear, oh, no, I don't mean you. Saw it most starkly. I know I hit this button a lot, but we saw it most starkly after Brexit on immigration, where even children, sons and daughters-in-law, were being told by their partner's parents who'd voted for Brexit to get rid of the immigrants. They're saying, no, I don't mean you. I don't mean you. So these messages the Tories deliver to Middle England about the unemployed, they don't mean you, except as all our callers today are demonstrating, they really do mean you. Trudy is in Alton in Hampshire. Trudy, what would you like to say?
Yeah, so I was made redundant recently. I worked in the arts and culture sector, so it's really badly funded. I was really senior. There were a few senior jobs. Actually, I don't consider myself to be middle class. I was brought up in poverty, but thought that education was the way out of it. So I'm well educated. I've got degrees coming out of my ears, including a PhD.
Right.
But now I find that actually my education is not necessarily helping me.
Sure.
I applied for a job in Aldi. They asked me for my experience and qualifications. I tried not to put all my experience and qualifications down, but I had to put some down at least so that there weren't gaps. And they didn't want to know. So I applied for a job in Sainsbury's, and they didn't ask me for my education and qualifications. And I've got a job. Now, that's fine for now because I got a redundancy payout that's going to last me for a little while. So that money will help me stretch. But I was talking to my partner this morning, and I was the main breadwinner. He earns a very, very, very low wage.
Okay.
And I said, well, when that redundancy money runs out, we won't be able to survive on that Sainsbury's wage.
Yeah.
It's going to be difficult. I don't know what we'll do. I'm crossing my fingers that something will come up. I'm getting job interviews, and I'm getting feedback saying that I'm a strong candidate, but there's always something. Last week I had a job interview, and the wage was actually all right, but it was a couple of steps back. Sure. And they said to me, "Oh, so how, given what you did in your last role, how does this fit with your career trajectory then?" And I tried to answer it, but I don't think they bought it. I don't know, because they wouldn't give me any feedback.
And you don't want they don't want someone who feels like they're stepping down, even though you're desperate to step. I use the word advisedly, I promise, but you're ready, very, very ready to step down. There's still an aura attached to stepping down that you can understand an employer not liking.
Yeah, you're a flight risk, or potentially you're going to...
Or you're not going to be very happy in the job because you think it's beneath you or something like that.
Well, I definitely didn't think this job was beneath me. I know you didn't. But there's a chance that you might show up your manager because you've had certain experiences. Maybe you're more experienced than them. Who knows? So I think that can be an uncomfortable situation for somebody. Anyway, it's difficult. It's really difficult. And one of the things that I've been doing is looking, because there are a few senior roles in my industry, looking at my transferable skills. And one of the things that I'm really keen to do, I've worked through Arts and Heritage to look at social mobility and do projects that further social justice. And I've had some interviews in that area, and it's all about helping young people be socially mobile, which I think is really important. But I feel like no one is helping me now with my social mobility.
Well, and also you have managed to play by the rules in terms of social mobility. Education had propelled you to a place that your circumstances wouldn't have propelled you to naturally, by which I mean privilege.
To a point.
To a point, and now the ground has disappeared almost from beneath your feet.
Absolutely, and I've got no family safety net. I haven't got a bank of mum and dad that I can draw upon. I've got a big mortgage because I haven't got a bank of mum and dad. So it's difficult. It's really difficult.
What do you say to Jeremy Hunt and Mel Stride when they tell you, because in a way you're both the proof of the pudding for them and the proof of why they're so horribly wrong for me, because you've got a job, there are jobs there, but it's not...
But it's not sustainable.
No.
I'm not going to be able, and, I'm really hoping that my new employer at Sainsbury's isn't listening and realising this, because, I can't do that job long term.
Because the wheels will come off your family life and your existence. And I think that is true, somewhat chillingly, if Jeremy Hunt and Mel Stride's advisors are listening. Every single caller today is in danger of losing their home. Every single one. I think I understood that correctly. That seemed to be where the current direction of traffic, if it's unstemmed, would lead. And two takeaways from it. The first is that when I asked you at 10 o'clock this morning what planet they inhabit, I don't think anyone could argue with me now that it's not a planet any of the people they're talking about inhabit. And the second bit was Ross, actually. Because when Ross, I thought very helpfully, and I think it does take courage to talk about mental health in any climate, but particularly in this climate, particularly if you're a man or a breadwinning man. It's why suicide rates among that category of people are so high, because you carry burdens, sometimes invisible. But for him to talk about being on anxiety medication and to remember that it was the same man, it was Mel Stride, who 10 minutes ago was denigrating people who seek help from their doctor to deal with their mental health and suggesting that they are swinging the lead in exactly the same way that unemployed people are turning their noses up at jobs for lifestyle reasons rather than livelihood reasons. But anyway, think on. It's 11:01.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
Five minutes after 11. Do you know, I am going to change our plans a bit. I'll talk about the sex education in schools tomorrow when I know more about it than I do now. Because at the moment, the laziness of the politics is it's so obvious that it almost makes every subject feel the same. On that one, just so that you know, because anybody conducting a conversation about sex education in schools who doesn't ask this question, I think is letting down everybody. How would an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old who was being sexually abused by an adult know that they were being sexually abused by an adult if the adult told them that they weren't, that it was all perfectly normal behaviour, unless somebody else somewhere is teaching them what is and what is not perfectly normal behaviour. And I mean, also looking at some of the detail that's emerging, and that's why I say I want more to emerge before we get stuck into it together. They're going to be teaching. Would you trust this lot? Seriously, would you trust them to run a bath? Never mind to run something as important as rewriting rules regarding sex education in schools, which do not currently appear to be in much need of rewriting. So you won't be taught about sex itself until you're 13. That would be contraception, sexually transmitted infections and abortion. But you will be taught about sexual harassment, revenge porn, grooming, stalking and forced marriage when you're 11. It's just got a touch of the evangelical Christian agenda to it, this, as far as I can tell. But as I say, I think I will hold off on that until I know a little bit more about it, until a little more... I mean, I think it is designed just to let them stick gender ID in a headline. But I've told you before, and I will tell you again, that the obsession with that subject on display in some quarters is not shared. For good or for ill, don't shoot the messenger. I watch the switchboards when other people talk about it, and it's not shared by the public at large. They are more concerned about the kind of things we were talking about in the last hour. They're more concerned about the millions of litres of raw sewage being pumped into Lake Windermere, or the third of mothers having traumatic experiences when giving birth, or the dangerous prisoners being released early because the prisons are full, or the fact that shoplifting is pretty close to not being a crime anymore, or the length of NHS waiting lists, or the difficulty of getting an appointment with a GP or a dentist, or the cost of food going up now as a direct consequence of the Brexit that Jacob Rees-Mogg and Nigel Farage told you would bring down the cost of those sorts of things. And you're welcome to add to my list. But let's have a slightly more philosophical discussion, shall we? PMQs is on the way at 12. I think, did Natasha and I have a small bet last week? Did we bet 50 pence that there'd be another defection from the Conservative benches to the Labour benches? Something on that, actually. Because something really weird happened after Natalie Elphicke defected to the Labour Party, which is a Conservative revealed that when she was a Conservative, she asked another Conservative for some sort of special treatment regarding her Conservative sex offender husband's legal case. I'll run through that again and see if you can spot what word is missing from this process. So a Conservative MP asked a senior Conservative politician for special treatment regarding the case of her Conservative sex offender husband, and all of the Conservatives who knew about it kept it secret for 4 years. So what have you got there? Conservative, sex offender, secret, 4 years, Conservative. Client Media this week has tried to turn it into a scandal for the Labour Party. That Natalie Elphicke reportedly or allegedly sought help from the then Attorney General with her sex offender Conservative MP husband's legal case. That I thought was a real moment. So I worry sometimes that you think I'm exaggerating. But it should have been 30p, my bet with Natasha, shouldn't it? Just a sort of a little nod towards Lee Anderson. But that was, for me, was possibly the clearest illustration yet of what client journalism looks like. Could you imagine taking that phone call and being told, actually, that's not fair, because the bloke that broke the story is a brilliant journalist. But you have to reveal the story. But to reveal the story and then watch as client journalists turn it into a problem for Labour, instead of saying, how the hell could the Conservatives, if this is a scandal, if what Natalie Elphicke allegedly did with Robert Buckland is in fact a scandal, then how the hell could all of these Conservatives have sat on it for 4 years? So you find yourself thinking just how bent things can actually become before anybody presses the alarm button. A Conservative MP asked a Conservative Attorney General to intervene inappropriately in the legal case of a Conservative MP who also was subsequently convicted of sex offences. And all of the Conservatives who knew about it kept it secret for 4 entire years. But Keir Starmer has questions to answer. Do you want to run that by me once more? Keir Starmer has questions to answer. I mention that because I don't know whether there is going to be another defection today. And if there is, then Natasha has to give me 30p. And if there isn't, I shall give her 30p. But I mention that because it also became clear later in the week that the reason why they're revealing such epic levels of hypocrisy and double standards is as a warning to any other Tories thinking of defecting. So one of their sort of cheerleaders in the media actually let the cat out of the bag and said, a Tory minister has told me that anyone else thinking of defecting is going to be spooked by what we've done to Natalie. So we keep so many secrets of scandalous behaviour by so many Tory MPs that if any of them ever think of defecting, then we'll just reveal all the secrets that we've been keeping for years in order to embarrass their new employers at the Labour Party, because that makes sense, doesn't it? I sometimes wonder why this stuff even needs explaining. And then I open the Daily Mail or the Daily Telegraph, or increasingly, I'm sad to say, the Times, and I think, yeah, this stuff needs explaining. And Idiot's Corner for this fella, James, she's not a Conservative MP. No. When she asked the Conservative Attorney General to intervene in the case of her Conservative sex offender husband, she was a Conservative MP, and all of the Conservative MPs from the Conservative whip down to Conservative backbenchers who knew about it were Conservative politicians, as was she, while they kept it secret. I just said that I can't quite believe that I need to explain this stuff, but there is PM popping into, I don't think it's the PM, but you never know, it might be. That's about how desperate they are these days, popping into Idiot's Corner. Right, I've done it twice now today, and it is a very silly thing to do. I'm going off on my little tangents at the top of the hour instead of halfway through, instead of setting up the phone in. And this actually traditionally is quite a difficult phone in to set up. So I've probably blown it already. And it will be quite a short phone in anyway, because PMQs comes up at 12 o'clock and we like to have a little look at the runners and riders before we cross live to the House of Commons. So should we do an experiment? Should we try and do a phone in the old-fashioned way, where I just tell you what the subject is and you ring in with your opinions before I inflict a 27-minute monologue upon you? And do you think this will work, or have I actually now gaslit and groomed you into a place where you won't be able to deal with a traditional phone? I'm not going to invite on the political editor of the Daily Bugle because I can't be bothered to think through the facts myself, or have some other largely unqualified guest to try and get the conversation going. I'm not that traditional. But if I just say what the subject is, if I say how worried should we be about ... And then if you don't ring, I'll give you a 20-minute monologue after the next break. How's that? Does that work? Is everybody happy? What's not to like? So here's the question. Something about the phrase facial recognition technology chills me to the very core, right? But then I read that they've been using it in Croydon to make arrests for offences including rape, robbery, fraud, grievous bodily harm, and possession of Class A drugs. So this is people who have slipped through the net, if you like, of the authorities, people whose identity is known, whose photographs are on a system, and who are currently, despite the charges against them or the suspicions they're facing, are currently evading and eluding all justice and scrutiny. So they walk past a camera that's loaded up with their image, and the camera goes, that fella over there is wanted for questioning about a rape. And then the chill to my core that I feel at the very use of the phrase facial recognition technology begins to melt a bit. So, what do you think about the police using facial recognition technology? All right? And if you don't ring in on this, I'll give you a 20-minute monologue after the next break. So it's entirely on you. I don't want any complaints about 20-minute monologues. It's entirely on you. What do you think? Because they're bringing it in. I should just tell you briefly that they're the Metropolitan Police is about to get £550,000. Yeah, it won't buy you much, will it? Imagine getting out of a PPE contract. Anyway, they're about to get £550,000 to bolster their use of live facial recognition. It will be cameras fitted on top of police vans, scanning the structure of our faces as we walk past and assessing them immediately against a list of wanted suspects and alerting officers if there is a match. That is what is going to happen it is already happening on the streets of London and I suppose other cities. It's going to start happening a lot more under this government. That is not the future, that is the present. What do you think of it? Because I could give you 52% conniptions, 52% reservations, 52% fears, and 48%, well, you know, if you've got nothing to hide, which is a terrible and frightening road to go down. But when they say that they're actually arresting suspected rapists, robbers, fraudsters, violent criminals, suspected violent criminals, and Class A drug dealers, what's the balance? What's the philosophical balance here? It's 11:15. That's the end of the monologue, unless you don't call me to tell me what you think about facial recognition technology being used by the police to identify wanted suspects. In which case, I'll give you an excellent and extremely long monologue after this.
James O'Brien on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
I'm receiving reports that the people who told you that we would be able to negotiate a brilliant Brexit deal by threatening to walk away because we needed them more than they needed us are now turning exactly the same argument to the European Convention on Human Rights. But I'm not currently prepared to believe that even some of the characters who rose to prominence during that era, such as Brexit hardman Steve Baker and Mark Francois, I'm not currently, without more proof, I'm not prepared to believe that has actually happened. So I hopefully will be able to bring you more on that by the time we start setting up, laying the table, shall we say, for PMQs later this hour. But first, well, I don't know, really. Do you think that's enough, Keith? I'm not sure that. What do you reckon? Take some calls or do a 20-minute monologue? I don't know. There's a lot of pressure on John in Maidenhead here, to be fair, but we shall see. It's not the only call, but it's not a full bustling switchboard like I would normally get at the end of a 20-minute monologue. Oh, well, okay. I'm in for a penny, in for a pound. John in Maidenhead, facial recognition technology. What would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello.
I'll bite. This is my world. This is my industry. It's my whole career.
Okay.
Security system. So it's a tough one. Is the short answer.
This is why I have to do 20-minute monologues, man. So people
James,
don't come on and say it's a tough one. Of course, it's a tough one. It's why we're talking about it.
Okay.
Carry on.
So I would, if I was Lord of the World and had all the levers to pull, I would probably set a line somewhere, and I would talk to judges and police officers about where that line would need to be set, because I would start with, so in order to socialise the systems and how they come, because they are inevitable, they are coming.
Why are they inevitable? Simply because the technology is irresistible. Here is here's a database of people that are wanted. Here is a technology that can actually stick a flag on their heads. How can you possibly not eventually embrace it?
So, yes, but it's inevitable because it's commercialised, and commercial enterprises will be able to do it themselves. You'll find it in Macy's, you'll find it in Selfridges, you'll find it in Tesco's, and as soon as it's everywhere... So that's just to keep an eye on known... That's to keep an eye on known shoplifters rather than to apprehend them. They will use it for their own means, whatever they feel like that's doing, whether it's managing store abuse, whether it's managing other incidents in their stores or whatever. And then what you'll see is then it will happen at football grounds. It will be, the safest grounds will be the ones that have all of this. So then you'll find that FIFA will be mandated, and then they'll turn around to the government and say, why didn't you do this already? You're too slow. So it is inevitable. That's fine. Then we've got to work out how we socialise it, how we make it work. Well, the way we make it work
slow down a bit, because this is really, really interesting. You can have all the time you want, seriously, because you can fill all the space that would have had the interminable monologue in it. So there's no need to rush. I understand the first bit. The inevitability of it is going to be driven by the fact that private sector companies are going to pay for it.
Yes. And then, so what you then find is that in order to make it, because there's been some bad PR with these systems. In the past, some of the earlier systems had an accidental racial bias, and that's now been fixed in lots of areas. There's lots of companies that have managed to get that to a point where it's now
as in it found it harder. It found it harder to properly process black faces than it did white faces. So you say that's been dealt with. I'm looking at an article from October of 2020 from Harvard University in their Science Policy and Social Justice blog, and you, as someone who works in the sector, is saying that definitely was a problem, but it is a problem in retreat.
Yes, it is a problem that is being dealt with. I have no doubt that further study of wider samples will find disparities that appear to be something to do with the system, and it would be tough to know if it is the system, or if it would be tough to know if it's nose shapes, or if it's to do with other things that hasn't been accounted for yet. But I know people that build these algorithms, and I know people that do this, and it is being dealt with. So in order to deal with that, because you need to address that problem, otherwise the public won't trust you, you then have got to find a way to bring it in a way that they can trust. So the way that I would do that is I would use a line of very serious crimes that everybody can get behind. So you'd use all the big stuff. You'd use murders. You'd use long outstanding warrants. You'd use international. But that means that
I'm sitting in my van, and you walk past, and my computer starts beeping, and I look at it and say, "Oh, it's all right. He's only wanted for GBH, or he's only wanted for shoplifting. We'll let him go."
You just wouldn't turn that on, because you can't.
Well, then where is it turned on then?
So that's what I'm trying to say. You would set a line at a certain type of crime, and I don't know where that line is. I was asked by your producer about knife crime, and I think knife crime could be used, but I would worry about it, because knife crime is something that is overly criminalised.
The people wouldn't be put on the database unless they'd committed a crime above the threshold you're describing.
Yes, exactly. And then I would do that, and I would actually legislatively lock that so that it couldn't be changed for 1 term, 2 terms, whatever. So that way, there's no worry about creep in the short term. There's just an ability to build trust in the systems. What you then do is you then have the ability to say, look, we think this is handled X and Y and Z crimes. We have this evidence over this reasonable time period, at which point we'd now like to lower that threshold to this. And what you probably have to do in the first instance is maybe even define a hard stop that is never allowed to be breached, no matter who it is, no matter what reason. Because I think if you start trying to do it for parking tickets,
that's the problem, isn't it? See, that you're the perfect caller, because you are addressing both my perspectives on this. You're addressing my sort of warmish reception, because it will help us catch bad people, and that has been proved, and you know that the technology is literally designed to do that. But now you're addressing unintentionally my cold chill, because you say all of these sensible things, and I just think to myself, what if Suella Braverman is Home Secretary?
Yes, and that's why you would need to lock it. That's why I would never turn it on until some real hard lines have been. I don't know if you've ever heard the
already on.
Give me a second. Have you heard there's a rules of robots or rules of AI? Have you ever heard those? That kind of in lots of different sci-fi movies.
Yes, it goes back to Isaac Asimov, I think.
Yes. And so as a result, you'd have to have some kind of version of that for these systems in order to say, these systems will never be allowed to do this or never be able to, because that would undermine the
so
the
what you're telling us
fabric that it would help fix.
You would need complicated, intelligent, visionary, and evidence-driven legislation provided by the current generation of politicians.
You would, and then we have a whole different problem. Yes, okay, I've got a monologue on that. Well, what we would need to do is we would need to make sure that we try and work out anywhere and everywhere this can be used. Because what you'll find is it will start to get used in car washes, so you can pay for your car wash automatically. It would start to get used in
because I'm already using it on my phone.
Yeah, exactly. So it's coming. It's already coming. So that's why the inevitability is there.
Okay.
What we need to do is work out what we're going to allow it to be used for, what we're going to allow it to be used for profit, because ultimately anybody that has profit as their main driver is not going to have the customer's well-being at their main
But you say this as someone working as a security system specialist in the private sector.
Yeah, and it's
worth double coming from you. It's worth double coming from you. Can I run something by you on the mechanics of it? And I know that part of your answer will involve saying, yeah, but it will get better.
It depends.
Yes, exactly. But you're not allowed to say that. Have you seen the Specsavers advert where the vet is sort of accidentally treating a fur hat?
I think
it's
I
a
might
cat.
have.
Okay.
I think I might have, yeah.
It has been suggested that person looks a lot like me, the person playing the vet in that Specsavers advert. Personally, I think anyone who thinks that needs to go to Specsavers, but that is a conversation for a different day. There's also a bloke in the Vikings. There's also an actor who's an Irish actor who's rather gratifyingly getting more and more work, who does look at times from a certain angle like my doppelganger.
Okay.
What is how does that get dealt with?
The short answer, James, is that you thinking it looks a little bit like you is a bit like saying that you look quite similar to Keir Starmer, because to you they look similar, but actually there's so many things about your nose or your hair or your lack of it, your ears or other things about you. Even the way you walk, the speed of your
the
walk,
gait stuff is absolutely fascinating.
Exactly.
Truly, it's humans at the moment doing that, but presumably the AI is not far behind.
Yes, so there are so many things. And what the first thing that would probably happen is that you would get picked up based on behavioural analysis that indicates you are a 99.9% likelihood for the person. Okay. Then I guess the first thing they would probably do is then do some kind of biometric confirmation. Check your veins, check your fingerprints, check whatever else that we've allowed them to have as part of this system in order to protect it on the street. Because the last thing you want to do is pick someone up, chuck them in a cell for murder, because that's the thing they've been found to be, only to then just check their, driver's ID or their fingerprint and find out it's a completely different person. And this is the 0.001%, because that will be possible. We have 7.5 billion. We'll have more in the future. That has got to be possible.
And how naive does it sound when I say now to you, and I'm sure you've heard it before, yeah, but what about George Orwell, mate?
He was right, and this still happens. The two can be, you can hold two heads in your brain at the same time and still walk and still think and still talk. So he's right, and it will happen, and that's why controls are going to be part of it. What you'll likely find is that in this fictional future world, let's say it's 10 years away, it wouldn't surprise me if there were independent cities where mayors decided to not apply it and say, look, that's a plus of our city. That doesn't happen. Okay. We manage it by extra police, we manage it by extra this, we manage it by extra shop assistants. You will still have the oldie worldy feel back from the late 2020s in this city if you come here, because I am paying for it.
You're amazing. I mean, I'll let Tim actually take up this. He says, James, you have to love it when you have a caller who really knows their stuff, says Tim. And I can only agree. I'm not so sure about Stephen in Milton Keynes, who's written in capital letters, oh my God, that's it. The vet in the Specsavers advert. It's been killing me to try to work out who you look like. And then final question, I promise, because I've got to go to the news. And this makes me sound a bit middle-aged, but I am a bit middle-aged, and I don't like seeing young people, for example, sitting on trains who are clearly wearing masks for non-COVID or health-related reasons. They've increasingly got into the habit now of covering their faces. Yeah. Do you think that is partly due to the prevalence in some parts of town of this technology already? And B, doesn't this raise the possibility of lots of people walking around with their faces completely covered?
It could. I would have to think about that because it isn't something that we've encountered in business, in the corporate world. Ultimately, when you walk in the front door, if you had a face mask on and we were using facial recognition, the security guards would inform you that in order to enter the building, you must remove it for at least the identification stage. So at that point, you would then have it so that I would do it at entrances to train stations, exits to train stations, so you can get on a train, but you won't be able to get into it until you've done it.
Fair enough. And then you can put it back on again. And you could possibly do it in a private booth for people who cover their face for religious reasons, I suppose.
Exactly. So it's completely manageable. But like any toys, like any technology, the whole thing needs to be used. And I think it might have even been said by some radio host that's doing quite well for himself. Something like, you need to put it in the hands of your worst enemy and to put them on a bad day and see what they can do with it. And that's what you need to legislate for.
Yeah, well, that would be what you could call the Suella Braverman principle, wouldn't it? Indeed, you're absolutely right. John, what a legend.
James O'Brien. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
11:33 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. So can we find the civil rights equivalent of John in Maidenhead? So John in Maidenhead speaking powerfully and incredibly knowledgeably from the perspective of the technological reality and going for, I don't think, an entirely irrefutable challenge or relationship between technology being available and technology therefore being inevitable. I think, oddly, the conversation about smartphones and teenagers is in that territory in ways that I didn't expect to happen. The idea of just because you've got a genie doesn't mean you're going to let it out of the bottle. So can we find the philosophical equivalent of that to put forward the opposite point? Why we shouldn't want facial recognition technology on our streets, even if we accept the possibility that it might be impossible to stop it. Because you've got it on your phone, possibly. Do not at me to tell me that you haven't got facial recognition technology on your phone. Although the lady that did message me to say that her twin sister can't open her phone, her identical twin sister can't open her phone, kind of speaks to John's point about it doesn't really matter that I look a bit like a bloke in a Specsavers advert. I'm not going to be arrested for any crimes that he's not going to be arrested for any crimes that I may have committed. So does anyone want to run us through? Do you want to run us through what the actual reservations are, the philosophical reservations are, why you never want to live in a country where there's a van on the corner of your street scanning your face and comparing it to a database of wrongdoers? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Because I don't want to offend Frank or James, who are waiting to talk to me. But that experiment did not work. Dropping the monologue and speaking instead to a brilliant... Because I had no guarantee that John in Maidenhead would ring in, right? Normally, as I near the end of my monologue and I start saying, and if you hit the numbers now, you will get through, my switchboard goes off like the Blackpool Pleasure Beat, goes off like the Blackpool Illuminations. And that has not happened on this. It might be that it's not a subject you're interested in talking about, but I doubt it. I think it's because you now need the monologue to set out the various stalls to which you can then come and shop. So John in Maidenhead turned up, and he will probably be the best caller we'll take on this subject. But what I don't have is the quantity that I can normally rely on alongside the quality. Again, no offence to Frank and James, who are waiting to talk. So that has not currently proved anything. We have not received a lesson in the wisdom or otherwise of dropping the monologue. But I will read these out in the hope that John's still listening. James writes, yet another top show, and what a caller, top man. Lynn's writes, so a listener with personal expertise doing the intro with you, James. Fascinating. Thoughts for the future? No, because I don't have my usual groundswell of contributors quivering in anticipation at the end of a phone line. So it doesn't work like that. And Jamie writes, you get the most amazing callers. Wow, did he know his stuff? And he really communicated it clearly. And Sarah asks, could Esther McVeigh use this technology to screen out civil servants wearing rainbow lanyards? So we'll talk to Frank next. And then I've got an update for you on something that happened on yesterday's programme, which was, I think it played out nicely when a Scottish National Party supporter started criticising Keir Starmer for not having attacked Rishi Sunak for attacking all Scottish nationalists in a speech that appeared to liken them to Houthi rebels and anti-Semites and Vladimir Putin. And just at the end of the conversation, I suddenly spotted the zinger, and I said, hang on a minute, has John Swinney condemned Rishi Sunak yet? I'm fairly confident that he hadn't. But that may have changed, and we'll catch up with that story shortly, because I wonder whether Stephen Flynn is going to bring it up at PMQs. But first, with gratitude, Frank, and not in any way suggesting that you're carrying the can for the lack of response to this question, Frank in Carlisle, what do you think about facial recognition technology?
Hi, James.
Hello, mate.
I don't have a great problem with it. I mean, there are some caveats, obviously. If they hadn't resolved, as your previous caller said they haven't resolved the sort of racial bias that was present in some of the early systems, fine. The next thing is, what do you do when you get a hit? So say I'm walking down the street to Carlisle and the van spots me and thinks I look like a drug dealer, and the police, what do the police do then? If they jump out and pin me to the ground and lock me in a cell, then yeah, I'm going to have a problem with it. But that's the response to it. That's not the technology. If they come out and ask to see my ID so that they can, figure out who I actually am, then fair enough. Because where are they getting the pictures from in the first place that they're comparing it against? I'm assuming that if they've got a photo of a person that they want to have a conversation with, that, you're already on their database.
Well, then so, I don't know that I'm going to play this card with every call, but it's quite possible. What about when Suella Braverman is Home Secretary and she decides to put you on a list, a prescribed list, because you attended a Palestinian peace march, or because you think that fossil fuel companies, you've protested against fossil fuel companies? Do you see what I mean?
But what crime, fair enough, if my face is on a database... They decide what a crime is. March.
They decide what a crime is. That's the problem. I don't think you can separate the two. And we've had a really interesting crash course since Suella Braverman and Priti Patel got into the Home Office in just how desperate these people are to reclassify peaceful protest as crime. It just makes you even less likely to protest against an oppressive government if you think that I could be on a list somewhere 10 years later, 5 years later. What if the database is never erased? What if something that's not a crime today becomes a crime tomorrow? And they are instructed and they're empowered by an oppressive government to round you up 2 years later for something that wasn't even a crime when you did it in the arena of peaceful protest.
I totally take your point, but there's ways for them to do that without facial recognition. So
make it easier for them. Let's not make it easier.
But the question on the technology, this is the sort of technology is neutral, but what we do with it isn't.
Yeah.
So therefore, if you'd have said on the call-in, ring in if you think Suella Braverman being in charge of all of this is a good idea, then I'd be on the other side of this discussion straight away.
And yet she could be.
Yeah, but
And also, are you sure about that technology point? What was the line? I like the line about technology being neutral. What about the presumption?
People do,
No, I know, but what about the presumption of innocence until you're proved guilty? Doesn't this start from the opposite point? This technology.
Well, I mean, we have a technology like this, with cars, don't we? The police cars can scan a number plate, and as they drive down the motorway, and if they see somebody,
they do AMPR. Yes, yeah, but that's different. That's not my face.
Yeah. That's not a face, no, and you can guarantee that the car
I've still got reservations.
Right.
Have you watched The Great Escape?
The old movie, yeah.
Yeah. Do you remember who was getting onto the train? It was Gordon Jackson.
Right.
Getting onto the train, and the Nazis asked to see his papers.
Yeah.
And then they said, "Have a nice day," and he said, "Thank you," and gave himself away, and they took him away and shot him. Did you watch that as a child?
Yeah.
Did you not think on some level, did you not think, oh gosh, I'm glad that I don't have to show my papers all the time walking around Kidderminster or Carlisle in your case?
Well, again, that's also in this country we don't. In other countries you do.
Exactly, but this is further than having to show your papers. In a way, this means that even by showing your face, you're being checked on by the authorities.
Don't get me wrong. I have a sort of a reservation about it, but I, if it's a question of do we catch people?
That is often what it comes down to.
Strolling down the street, or don't we? If the side for people who are falsely, it's not like a death sentence where, oh, sorry, we got you wrong, but you're dead, you can't go back.
That's true. No, that's true. Well, it depends.
Can we stop you and have a question?
They use it in China. They're going to lock you up and harvest your organs for having stepped out of line in society. But we can possibly reassure ourselves that that's never going to happen here. in which case there is a book that we should all read called It Couldn't Happen Here? So Upton Sinclair, anybody helping me out here? Anybody else got a brain like mine that just files stuff away and sometimes struggles to recover it? Thank you, Frank. Strong call. James is in Folkestone. James, do you want to know something interesting?
Sure.
I have met 2 people recently who moved to Folkestone because they sort of undertook an audit of their incomes, outgoings, lives, ambitions and family plans, and they did a sort of algorithm based upon all of those inputs, and in both cases, Folkestone came top of their list, so they both moved there.
Oh, nice. That's a good advertisement for Folkestone, I guess.
It is, isn't it? It's nice. I must come and visit. It sounds like it's got a literary festival as well, I was told by one of them, who is also an author. So anyway, that's not why you rang in, but that's the kind of bonus content you get when you do, James. Carry on.
You should visit. I'm sure you'd enjoy your visit.
Nice.
But, the reason I called was, whilst I understand, the benefits that come from employing technologies like facial recognition, and it's undeniable, right? It's catching sexual abusers, people, like the worst of society. We just have to be careful about the slippery slope because biases exist in human beings, and the data that's being used to train facial recognition is just going to be a reflection of the bias that exists in our society.
Well, this is exactly my worry, really. And you've got the same lot, the Tories coming out today calling for more stop and search, which we all know means ignore the reasons why certain demographics may be more involved in crime than other demographics and just go after the demographics, not the poverty or not the social conditions.
Yeah, exactly. And to be fair, I wouldn't be completely against it because I work in the industry, so I'm not going to say, it's completely terrible. And this is probably a bit counterintuitive to my point because it doesn't save people's faces. If used very responsibly, it can be a useful tool. But there's a reason why, OpenAI, which is one of the leading companies that work with machine learning and artificial intelligence, has had an open-wide ban on police enforcement using their technology, especially in the US.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So it is about whose hands it's in a way, and what. And that's the other point. So Marion has been in touch and says the problem isn't what happens when police use it to police crimes, but what happens when it's used to police union membership or union organisation. And you're probably too young to know about this. But there was a blacklist in the construction industry for years. Ricky Tomlinson out of the royal family was even on it. And it just meant that if you demonstrated any previous association with trade union activity or trade union ideology, you would be prevented from working for various construction firms, including all the biggest names in the business. There was a test case where about £2 million was paid out to trade unionists who'd been blacklisted by 50 trade unionists had been blacklisted. And that's just when they've got your name on a list. If they've got your face on a database, and you've in the past caused trouble for an exploitative employer, or you've been a trades union activist, then that could cause all manner of problems as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm gonna read about that and check it out.
It is interesting. So it's a mad tale. I'm late for the junction. That's the only reason I'm moving on, because it is Wednesday, which means PMQs is upon us. But we should have time for at least one or two more calls before that. The number you need if you want to join in is 0345 6060 973. I like these conversations. They're not fully satisfactory, are they? Because on one side you can pile up evidence and logic even, and on the other it's a bit Project Fear. You're saying, yeah, but this bad thing could happen, and then the other person simply has to say, yeah, but it won't happen, just relax. And people go, oh, well, that's okay, then I'll vote for it. And the next thing you know, we've done a Brexit. So Project Fear probably deserves a little bit more attention than it gets, or should be heeded more than it gets heeded. But it remains almost powerless in the face of people listing benefits. No, that's not quite, the Brexit analogy doesn't quite work, does it? Making unkeepable promises would be the equivalent of that. But do you see what I mean? Maybe the people warning us to be fearful should be listened to more.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10 to 12. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Do you want a little bit of insight into my personal life? I mean, we're encouraged to share some details sometimes of our domestic bliss. My new lawnmower conked out at the weekend, and I've contacted the manufacturer. I was just getting close to getting on my high horse about it. Mrs. O'Brien's just texted me to say, I just switched it off and switched it on again. It's working fine now. So that's my life, honestly. I just... oh, dear. SMH. Facial recognition technology. Haziq is in Stoke-on-Trent. Haziq, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that, police surveillance van stuff.
Yes.
Because I was hearing the other caller talk about it, and I mean, I agree with you. He's really well clued up on this stuff, and it was really good to listen to it.
Yeah.
But
I knew there was a but. I like big butts. I cannot lie. Carry on, Haziq.
Yeah, obviously there's ethical considerations, right?
Yes.
Whenever we talk about this kind of stuff, whether it's AI, machine learning, anything like that, there's always the ethical side to it. You put out this kind of model to people, and obviously eyebrows are going to be raised. They're going to be like, oh, what about my privacy? What about my, that I care so much about my data, but then they use Facebook, that kind of thing.
Yes.
So, the police surveillance vans. Now, we can have that scenario, and this is kind of a way they can use it with ethical considerations in mind. You have a policy, right? So the use of surveillance vans is restricted to very high crime rate areas.
Yeah, but then Suella Braverman becomes Home Secretary. So all of the... and this is the problem with all of these clever points.
So you have a specific warrant outlining the scope and duration of the surveillance, but you be very transparent about it. So every month, every week, whatever it is, you publish detailed reports on the uses of the surveillance vans, including data of the number of scans, demographics of identified individuals, and the outcomes. But there's also oversight. So maybe put an independent oversight body there and be you need to review the deployment of the vans, audit the collected data, investigate any complaints of misuse. But also there needs to be an aspect of community engagement. When we talk about stop and search, especially in London, the reason it's so sort of pushed away against and, stuff like that, because the community aren't very happy with it, right? They don't like the fact that there's a lot of racial bias. And, they probably I think it has been proven in the past that... But
the people bringing in the technology we're talking about, they love a bit of racial bias, whether you're talking about the Metropolitan Police, the Conservative Party, or their voter base.
Yeah. And I think that's, I was having a conversation with one of your producers before I spoke to you.
Yeah. Good.
And it's all about...
We can't let anyone on willy-nilly.
It's a good start, isn't it? Yeah, but it's all about, the people who are behind these algorithms, right? IBM,
but this is what frightens me, because we can have this conversation until the cows come home. But at the end of the day, if we've learned anything from Britain and America since 2016, is that you can end up with absolutely rotten people in charge. You can end up with Donald Trump in the White House, Boris Johnson in Downing Street, Suella Braverman in the Home Office. So I do wonder whether the role of the citizenry is to prevent any government from having the kind of powers that a future rogue government could use to hurt us and oppress us and silence us.
Yeah, no, it's a balance between catching these criminals and keeping, let's say, knife crime off the streets and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Or we care too much about the ethical implications about rogue governments that we just don't... the rogue government's going to be there whether we have this technology or not. Do you know what I mean?
Yes and no. And the one about knives, the one that detects knives from a distance, whenever a suspect passes between 2 points, it sets off some sort of alert, whether officers are there or not. I've got no beef with that, because, if people really think you are carrying a knife because they've got a machine that says you're carrying a knife, then racial profiling doesn't come into it at all, does it? It's only when you're stopping young black kids because they claim they can smell weed, or there's been a robbery around the corner which was committed by another black person who probably doesn't look anything like you. That's when the community tensions come in. So I've got no problem with that, but there's something about faces being checked by technology that just, it's all a bit, it's not Minority Report, but it is 1984.
Yeah. But I know you're going to laugh at this, but it gets better over time. And that's the thing with these neural networks and the training data sets, right? You start off with a set amount of data, let's say 1 million faces.
Yeah.
the neural network and the AI machine model will go through this data, split it into testing and training sets, and it will test itself.
Right.
And it'll say, this is the training set. Look how close I am, and it'll improve its accuracy over time.
So it will just get better and better and better and better.
The more faces you add into it, and the more you train this model and say, this is what is right and this is what is wrong,
the better it will get. And the more, that's why the early caller was confident that some of the racial problems with the technology a few years ago were already in retreat. Although, having said that, I know that the rather splendid people over at the Workers' Information Exchange are looking into racially discriminatory facial recognition systems being deployed by companies like Uber, although that article is from October of 2021. So whether or not the technology has improved since then, I would say probably, having listened to you and to John earlier. I'm going to squeeze in one more call, but you're going to have to be quite brief. Vishan is in Grays. Vishan, what would you like to say?
Hi. So I think the question isn't about whether we are going to have it, whether we should have it. It's going to be a matter of when. This technology is so incredibly powerful that the benefits typically, especially in the security industry and even in the retail sector, if you go out and buy a security camera and you see what it can do with facial technology for your own home, it's unbelievable. So imagine that deployed within the security sector. So it's not a question of...
Yeah, but that's not... I haven't got a database, Vishan.
So here's the point, the main point that I was going to make. It only takes a second for you to turn over, say, the passport database or the driving database.
Yeah.
And if you've got a government willing to do it, and given our track record with some of the decisions our governments have made, to turn that over as the training model for this technology.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to fearmonger, but
you're not
that could be done within...
You look me in the eye and tell me that Suella Braverman wouldn't sell us all up the Swanee River in a flipping heartbeat if she thought it would get her the keys to Downing Street.
If you look at how big the industry is for buying and selling data anyway, it's incredible. It's incredible. So it would take a government literally minutes to turn something that
so there's nothing we can do about
the training model.
There's nothing we can do about it because we're not going to be able to crush the technology because there are private sector applications for it, and then it will just at some point, if not here, then somewhere, if not now, then when, a government will use it in the most hideous and oppressive ways. We'll probably see something in China or Russia before we see it here.
It's already deployed within the military sector across the world at an incredible pace, and consumers are the last people to receive the benefits of this technology. So you can only imagine where the government...
The military-industrial complex, Vishan, I think, is of what you speak. Well, what a phone-in. Thank you. I don't know that it would have been... I think it would have been a bit better if I'd done a 20-minute monologue at the bit. No, I do. And I know you do as well. But who knows? It's one of those great alternative universes now that none of us will ever be able to visit. Natasha Clark is here. I've changed the terms of our wager.
You can't do that.
Yes, no, I think you'll find I can.
Absolutely
can't. How long have you been here? I think you'll find I can.
Go on, try me.
It's 30p now, not 50p, because I thought Lee Anderson has been a bit quiet lately. So it's time to...
I'm afraid we didn't shake on the previous bet.
We didn't shake on the previous bet.
Does that mean it's all off?
No, 30p if... So I will give you 30p if there is no defection.
Okay, but it was 50p.
Yeah, all
so
right.
You're
already,
well,
I'll give you 50p.
You're reneging on your bet.
Some radio theatre, Natasha. It's just light and shade on the wireless.
Just think the readers.
What time did the defection drop last week?
It was 11:59, and it's
now 11:59.
11:59 and 22 seconds.
So it's looking good for you.
It's looking quite good, I'd say. Although, honestly, Twitter is going crazy with speculation at the moment.
Of course it is. We love that.
Oh, I've seen a seat mysteriously left empty behind Sir Keir Starmer.
Theresa May, people were suggesting yesterday.
I've seen a Conservative MP in a red dress. Like, what does that mean?
How interesting.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we'll see.
Well, let's keep an eye on
I think I'm going to win still.
I think you are, 30p. Let's keep an eye on that and look instead, or rather look first at what you think
at my
might
terrible
come up.
predictions.
Yeah.
Yeah. I heard it yesterday. I do listen to it.
Well, I said mine are bad. I bet yours are worse.
You did.
Go on.
Okay. Labour want to talk about knives today. They want to talk about the criminal justice bill coming back to Parliament later this afternoon, and about how they will crack down on zombie knives. But what you were talking about earlier in the Times, I'd say would be a good safe bet for Sir Keir Starmer to go on, because it fits into his narrative of the Tories are gaslighting you on the economy over jobs figures.
This is Stride and Hunt saying it's really easy to get a job.
There's loads of jobs out there if only you'd looked a bit harder, and we don't want a culture of people languishing on benefits, as they wrote in the Times today. We've also just in the last few hours had the news that the MOJ have triggered yet another emergency measure to stop overcrowding in prisons. That's something that Keir Starmer likes to talk about, the crisis in our justice system.
Yes.
That's another potential.
Yes, that is.
And we've also had some news about sewage being pumped into Lake Windermere as well this morning, as well as our own LBC exclusive about how there are thousands of miles of unchecked waterways pipes as well. So could that be something that Keir Starmer decides to raise? Potentially.
Well,
I'm hedging my bets, yeah.
That's 4 for 4.
That's 4.
Yeah. Probably not going to pick up on the speech, which has been redacted now. Have we got time for you to explain why that happens? The speech he gave at Policy Exchange, which there have been complaints that he shouldn't have used the government logo when he was delivering a speech at a secretly funded think tank that was clearly political rather than governmental. I don't think that Keir Starmer will pick up on that because it's the Scottish nationalists that will be most upset about it, the SNP MPs. So I think Stephen Flynn will probably go in on Rishi Sunak trying to... Oh, well, we're about to find out.
I don't even need to make a prediction.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On Monday, the Prime Minister treated us to his 7th relaunch in 18 months. He vowed to take on the dangers that threaten the country. So it was good to see the Minister for Common Sense immediately take up that mantle by announcing a vital crackdown on the gravest of threats, colourful lanyards. Meanwhile, in the real world, after 14 years of Tory government, the prison system is in chaos. Does the Prime Minister think that his decision to let prisoners out 70 days early makes our country more secure?
Well, Mr Speaker, civil service impartiality is an important principle that we're right to support, but perhaps he could ask his Chief of Staff about that. But actually on Monday, what I did do is outline the serious security threats that our country faces from an axis of authoritarian states. Russia poisoning people on our streets, China targeting our democracy, Iranian proxies firing on British ships, and yet he won't back our plan to increase defence spending. Now, we all know why, especially with the Deputy Leader and indeed the Shadow Foreign Secretary who voted to scrap our nuclear deterrent. It's clear that you simply can't trust Labour with our country's security.
Well, I appreciate he's been busy on the front line of the war against lanyards, but he must have missed this. I was the first to call for 2.5% on defence spending. The last time it happened was under the last Labour government, but it needs a credible plan, not his fantasy economics. But I am disappointed to see that version 7.0 of his time in office doesn't extend as far as answering questions or giving any information on those prisoners he is releasing early. Basic details like how many, where are they, what crimes have they committed. So will he at least guarantee that none of the criminals he is instructing prisoners to release early are considered high risk?
Mr Speaker, there are strict eligibility criteria in place with exclusions based on public safety, and no one will be put on the scheme if they were deemed a threat to public safety. But he talks about 2.5%, Mr Speaker. So if he does think it is important, as I think he just actually stood up and acknowledged that it was the right thing to do, we've got a fully funded plan to actually deliver an increase in defence spending, and it's him and his party who have refused to match that commitment.
Just like his £46 billion fully funded. If anyone was looking for the perfect metaphor for the shambolic government, we saw it on Monday. The Prime Minister woke up deciding his latest rebrand was Mr Security. But within hours, the Tory party was being investigated for accidentally publishing the personal details of hundreds of people. Mr Speaker, he must be the only tech brother on the continent who can't work a debit card or send an email. But he's not answered my question, so I'll try it again. Are any of the prisoners he is currently letting out early considered to be high risk?
Mr Speaker, he just showed spectacularly why he's just not fit to lead this country into the future. This country has a proud tradition of leading the world. We led the world when it came to the Industrial Revolution. But if he was around, he would have probably called James Watt the steam bro, Mr. Speaker. And what we're doing is preparing the country for the future. But when he talks about the prison scheme, let me be crystal clear. No one would be put on the scheme if they were deemed a threat to the public. Offenders are subject to the toughest of licensing conditions. And if those conditions are broken, they are back in prison for considerably longer. But what's his record on this? He voted against tougher sentences for violent criminals. He actually opposed new powers for the police to tackle violent crime, voted against new laws that have arrested 1,000 criminal people smugglers. The message is crystal clear. He can't be trusted to keep this country safe.
I appreciate that all this rebranding is taking all of his time, but he may want to read the recent inspection report into Lewes Prison. On this topic, I've asked him twice about. It documents, page 5, high-risk prisoners being released at short notice without sufficient planning. Page 46, a high-risk prisoner had his release date brought forward, despite a history of stalking, domestic abuse and a restraining order. Their words, he was a risk to children. Does the early release of stalkers, domestic abusers and those considered a risk to children sound like the work of someone who is making the country more secure?
Mr. Speaker, as I've said, no one should be put on this scheme if they are a threat to the public. And let me be crystal clear, it does not apply. And let me be absolutely clear, it does not apply to anyone serving a life sentence, anyone convicted of a serious violent offence, anyone convicted of terrorism, anyone convicted of a sex offence. And crucially, in contrast to the system that Labour had put in place, Mr. Speaker, governors in the prison service have an absolute lock so that no one is put on the scheme who shouldn't be. But thankfully, Mr. Speaker, their scheme let out thousands upon thousands of violent offenders onto our streets, and even 2 terrorists. Thankfully, we've toughened up sentencing against those criminals with new legislation, but he voted against it, Mr. Speaker.
Well, I'm glad to hear that those on life sentences are being released early, and he may not think that releasing domestic abusers is a problem, but Labour has repeatedly called for domestic abusers to be exempt from his scheme to release prisoners early. His government has shamefully ignored those calls. So now we have the evidence that domestic abusers are being released early. The Lewis report, Prime Minister, will he finally change course and back Labour's calls?
Mr. Speaker, as I've been crystal clear, there is an absolute governor lock on people who are put on the scheme. And in contrast to the last Labour scheme, prisoners were let out with no supervision, no electronic tags. In fact, 80,000 offenders were let out. 16,000 were violent, Mr. Speaker, leading to multiple murders committed. We fixed that system. But when it comes to this question, not only are we building the biggest prison programme in history, we're also deploying rapid deployment cells. And, Mr. Speaker, because on this side of the House, we understand the importance of prison. Unlike one of his frontbenchers who said, and I said, who quote, prison doesn't prevent crime. It's always the same with the Labour Party, soft on crime and soft on criminals.
He's literally letting criminals out early. Mr. Speaker, the only answer to the question I asked, whether domestic abusers should be exempt from his early release scheme from anyone serious about security, is yes. Perhaps the most ludicrous part of the Prime Minister's speech on Monday was when he said he won't accept the idea that any of the problems people are facing are caused by the 14 years of Conservative government. He won't say how many prisoners they've released early. He won't say if they're burglars, abusers or stalkers. He won't say where they are or what support their victims are getting. Yet he thinks he has the right to tell people they can't blame his government for any of it. Doesn't he think that rather than confiscating lanyards like some jumped-up milk monitor, He should stop issuing get-out-of-jail cards free to prisoners considered a risk to children.
Mr. Speaker, another week with no ideas and absolutely no plan for the country. They've had 14 years to think about nothing but the future, but all they can do is talk about the past, Mr. Speaker. But I am surprised, because what he didn't bring up that has happened in the last week since we met is that statistics confirm that we have now had the joint fastest growth rate in the G7 this year, Mr. Speaker. The Bank of England said that the economy had turned a corner. E&Y said our growth was impressive. The chief economist of the Independent Office for National Statistics said the economy is going gangbusters, Mr. Speaker. Now, the Shadow Chancellor may want to copy and paste their comments into her next speech. Or does she think they're all gaslighting the British public too?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While I understand the need to upgrade our broadband infrastructure, it cannot be right that a company called Brisk is proposing to erect telegraph poles in the Squirrels estate in Hayley Green in my constituency. So, would the Prime Minister agree with me that residents are 100% opposed to these proposals and they go against the guidance? So would the Prime Minister agree with me that they should abandon these proposals, that they should that we should have a review of permitted development rights in relation to this type of infrastructure, and he should give Ofcom greater power to investigate breaches?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for rightly championing the views of his constituents on this important topic. Network operators have to follow legal obligations when deploying their networks, and Ofcom can in fact investigate reports of failure to follow these obligations. And I know that the Minister for Digital Infrastructure has met the sector and Ofcom recently to raise concerns about reports of poor pole sighting, asked operators to share infrastructure, and I will ask her specifically to provide my honourable friend with a more detailed update.
Leader Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, on Monday the Prime Minister outlined what he considers to be extremist threats to our society, and in doing so he actively compared North Korea, Iran and Russia with those people in Scotland who believe in independence. So can I ask him to rise once to the standards befitting of his office and apologise for those puerile and pathetic remarks?
Mr. Speaker, that's not what I said, but I would say to the honourable gentleman that his party is indeed a threat to the integrity of the United Kingdom. And I hate to remind him, but that's literally their entire purpose, Mr. Speaker, because when the people of Scotland accepted the referendum in 2014, it was the SNP who didn't. They went on creating a Minister for Independence, focused on constitutional wrangling, ignoring the needs of the people. Education standards falling, taxes rising. So actually, finally, he should do the right thing, end the obsession with independence, and put the needs of the Scottish people first.
Mr. Speaker, let's be clear. What the Prime Minister did was not just equate my colleagues and I to despotic and dangerous despots across the world. He proactively compared almost half of the Scottish population with a war criminal like Vladimir Putin. And he did so as their Prime Minister, as the man who represents them on the world stage and the man who on these isles is tasked with defending their liberties and their democracy. Now, we know that his sorry time in office is rapidly coming to a conclusion. Is this really how he wants to be remembered?
Mr. Speaker, as ever, distracting from the actual record of what the SNP are doing in Scotland. And this obsession with independence means that Scottish school children are being let down, plummeting down international league tables. The Scottish NHS, the only place in the United Kingdom where funding is actually falling in real terms, and taxes going up for ordinary hard-working families and small businesses. That is what the SNP are doing in Scotland, while this UK government is delivering for them.
Dave Chopwell.
Yeah.
Prime Minister, the leader of the SNP and the leader of the opposition have managed to do something today that I pull off about twice a year, and I have several hundred goes at it. They've hit the brake bang on time.
James O'Brien on LBC.
17 minutes after 12 is the time. PMQs continues, of course, and we generally try to keep one ear on it, lest anything of particular interest should unfold. You were kind of right. You put so much on the table, Natasha Clark, that it would have been, frankly, miraculous if Rishi Sunak hadn't picked any of it up. But I beg your pardon, if Keir Starmer hadn't picked any of it up. But he did go in pretty hard on prisons with a side order of knives.
Yeah, not bad. I'll take a point there.
Good.
And yes, if we'd had time to discuss what the Prime Minister would have wanted to talk about, it's obviously the economy. And he thinks it's going gangbusters. I'd love to hear more evidence of that. But yes, going in on prisons is something that Keir Starmer's done a few times, and I think quite successfully. You know, our prison system, the Minister of Justice is in absolute crisis, and everybody knows it. But Rishi Sunak seemed not to know the details of this report from yesterday that was done by the Chief Inspector of Prisons into Lewes Prison, which, you know, Rishi Sunak was wrong, what he said at Prime Minister's Questions just now, when he said that high-risk offenders would not be released earlier. That is categorically not the case, according to this report that was released yesterday about Lewes Prison, which says that high-risk offenders were part of those cohort, which were being released early. And, you know, it completely destroys
Did Starmer bring
argument.
that point home strongly enough, do you think?
I think so. He did repeat it back to himself, but Rishi Sunak didn't have the answer. He didn't have the details on what that report said, and he just said they should not be being released early. Of course they shouldn't, but they are.
But they are being.
And it completely, you know, Keir Starmer was very tactical in choosing to go on this, because it destroys Rishi Sunak's argument from earlier this week that he is a risk to Britain's security.
Yes.
And it was a nice tie-in with that speech that Rishi Sunak gave on Monday.
What do we think about this gambit? I mean, when he says 7.0, he's talking about a sense that Rishi Sunak is a little bit like a detached shower head bouncing around in the bottom of your bath, in that you don't know what direction it's going to spray in next, and the idea of actually getting washed underneath it is it's slim. Because you know, he was the change candidate. We've spoken about that, and now he's the safe candidate, the security candidate. All of which, whatever costume he puts on, is undermined by the fact that they've been in power for 14 years. He's failed to sort of detach himself from that legacy. He tried that earlier this week by sort of talking about Liz Truss in terms. But why do you think? Usually there are focus groups involved, although we're in such uncharted territory now with this 6-month-long election campaign. Why do you think he is putting so much energy this week, because we don't know what version 8.0 will be, into trying to portray Keir Starmer as unsafe, a former DPP as being unsafe? I think they think it's they clearly think it's a good strategy to go down. Whether it will work, I really don't think so. I don't think the public are going to buy it, purely because I don't think you could accuse someone who, you know, a top lawyer who has worked as DPP for many years, as being somebody that doesn't care about the criminal justice system, that doesn't care about keeping our country safe. I just don't think that comparing Keir Starmer and Jeremy Corbyn are, you know, it actually feeds into It doesn't land, and it feeds into the narrative that Keir Starmer himself wants to portray, which is that Labour has a changed party and that he is no longer. This is the mad thing,
like Jeremy Corbyn.
Yes, I know.
Jeremy Corbyn isn't in the Labour Party anymore. You can't make that
Natalie
argument.
Elphicke is.
Yeah, and you know, whether you
for good
agree
or for ill,
you agree with that or not, the Labour Party is not the same Labour Party it was in 2020 when Keir Starmer inherited it, and he will absolutely relish making the point, but equally is choosing today to pick holes in Rishi Sunak's argument that the life would be unsafer under a Keir Starmer government, because just look at the amount of prisoners that you're letting out that are high risk.
Wandsworth
tears
Prison,
it apart.
Arguably an even bigger story this week than Lewes Prison. It's quite easy to remember, because the governor who has resigned following a prison inspection this week, or last Thursday, somewhat felicitously for people who struggle as they get older to remember names, is called Katie Price, which is a name that is not going to slip out of your mind anytime soon. Indeed, some coverage includes the brackets, not to be confused with the reality star, just in case you thought she might have been moonlighting as the governor of Wandsworth Prison. But the idea that the state of prisons or the state of criminal justice is something that Rishi Sunak can hit Keir Starmer with is, let's say, optimistic. What about national security? What about the idea that he would be less effective against threats from Russia or China? Because I'd like to see a little bit more flesh on these bones. I don't understand what he thinks he's doing, really.
So his argument, which he's trying to set out on Monday, is that because the Labour Party haven't committed to his timetable of 2.5% of 2030. That's going to, as he quote said, embolden our enemies like Putin.
Right, yes.
It's a bit of a step, isn't it?
It's a bit of a stretch, Natasha. There's Vladimir Putin cracking open
that's what Rishi Sunak said. He said,
Kremlin wine cellars tonight.
Can't believe it. Imagine what Putin's going to say when he reads this, is what Rishi Sunak said. I don't think he's paying too much attention, but I could be wrong. But look, it doesn't wash, because I think Rishi Sunak's late to the party on talking about security. I don't think he's been particularly on the front foot on defence spending. As Chancellor, we were constantly hearing about rows of him blocking more money for defence, and it wasn't a priority for him at all. He was the Chancellor. He was the guy in charge of the purse strings.
That's where the showerhead analogy comes from. Is he does it is just spraying everywhere.
And that's what I was speaking to somebody who used to work in Number 10 this week, and that's what they fear that is actually going completely wrong with the Sunak operation, is that the messaging is all over the place.
Scattergun.
It's a completely scattergun approach. And, they pointed back to elections, 2019 was the election they pointed back to, where they said that our messaging was really strong. And even if you remember the early days of the COVID pandemic, we all remember, and it was all drilled into our heads, the sort of wash your hands messaging that came from the government. And arguably that messaging was incredibly strong at the time. People did buy into it, and it worked. And that's something that you can't say about this government, and you can't say about this Prime Minister. We can talk about what Rishi Sunak is and wants to stand for. But I don't think anybody, if you have asked a voter on the street, what do you think the message coming out from the government is going to be, and what do you think of the things that Rishi Sunak will want to talk about in the election? I don't think, and even though we are so far away from an election, this is exactly what the government needs to be thinking about, what their messages are going to be, because they need to hammer them home every day from now until polling day if they've got a chance of winning. And
that laser-like focus on something, even if it's complete rollicks like get Brexit done, it makes campaigning so much easier.
Exactly.
And again, don't stop to examine the truth of the claim or the truth of the promise. I don't know if you follow John Byrne-Murdoch at the Financial Times. He's the king of graft. Brilliant. He's great, isn't he?
It's honestly too clever for me.
He put something up earlier this week about perceptions on crime and the way that we are all... I mean, our local crime experience is actually not bad. Most people, their genuine experience of crime in their local area is pretty steady, and it hasn't got particularly worse, and on it carries. The figures are falling, in fact.
They are, yeah.
But 2/3 of people think crime is on the rise. It's actually at its lowest level for 30 years. And the national picture, when people are asked, they think the national picture is getting worse. So they and it's media. This is largely a creation of media. But both party leaders have kind of handcuffed themselves to a bandwagon heading in the opposite direction. Sunak has somehow tried to turn it into crime will be worse under Keir Starmer, and Keir Starmer has to argue crime is terrible under the Conservatives. So for both of them are now in a space that doesn't actually exist. The Social Trends report shows 2/3 of people think crime is on the rise. The statistics reveal it's at its lowest level for 30 years.
That's
mad politics, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's obviously two levels of reporting crime: the actual crime data that comes in, but also I can't remember. It's the Crime Survey of England and Wales, I believe it's called, on whether you have reported or seen crimes but not reported them. So it's two different slight measures, and I believe they're both falling. But yes, it's obviously a perception that Keir Starmer wants to get into, because if his strategy to try and win over Tory voters, and like I say, the Conservatives, they are the people that you say usually have gone on crime, tough on crime. Rishi Sunak wants to say, look, I'm locking prisoners up for longer. I'm not releasing anybody before 2/3 of their sentence. That's something that they've produced, and they consistently want to be seen as the people that are tough on crime. We've got now, the results of that are now in our prisons, which are now overfilling. Yes. Arguably a success of government to keep dangerous prisoners up for longer. But yes, I think it is, and it potentially is the media's fault when
everybody thinks it's terrible, and it's actually getting better. We can all hold some responsibility for that.
Yeah, I think to point out that there are parts of the country that
of course
knife crime is going up, fraud is going up, shoplifting is going up, and people do have legitimate concerns about that too.
It's almost I don't mean you territory, isn't it? Crime's absolutely awful, but I don't mean where you live. And then Stephen Flynn. Now on this one, you were correct to call at prisons, but I think I almost got this word for word on what he would go in on his question.
Why is that?
Well, just because I thought it was a wide open goal. That if the Prime Minister stands up and compares you to the Russians, the Iranians and the Houthi rebels... Did
he though?
Well, that was what yesterday's phone-in was about.
I did, and I listened carefully to that.
And it was inconclusive.
I think that Rishi Sunak is correct to describe the SNP as a threat to Britain, to the United Kingdom.
Yes, but possibly not
right
putting to do it in the same breath as those other threats.
And it wasn't in the same breath. It was significantly later on in the speech, a good 4 paragraphs, I'd say, afterwards. So I don't think you can... I think the Scottish nationalists will seize an opportunity to hit the Prime Minister with that, but I personally think that it was slightly overhyped by them.
It was an odd exchange, in a way, because they're both speaking to completely different audiences. Stephen Flynn's followers will completely agree with everything he said, and Rishi Sunak's followers...
Well, they're both right, aren't they?
Well, precisely. You
works.
do seek the destruction of the United Kingdom in its current form, but paragraph placement notwithstanding...
they're not on the same level of Russia and China.
No,
and
but there was a
deliberate
conflation, I think. I mean, it wasn't a coincidence. It was a very odd thing to stick into the speech at all.
He was trying to scattergun absolutely... There was nothing he didn't talk about in that speech. Back to the shower analogy.
It's good, that, right?
It's quite good. I like it. We can use that again. But yeah, he absolutely tried to talk about everything in that speech, from education, the NHS, crime, security, culture wars. I'm surprised he didn't mention the lanyards, but which was, again, going back to PM's Q's, one of Keir Starmer's funniest off-the-cuff jokes, I think, this week was when he was saying, the Prime Minister's on the front line of the culture war against lanyards, and I think he's been busy with that, which was
Milk
was
Monitor
quite good.
Was quite good as well.
Milk Monitor
that
was quite
stick.
Good. James, did you have a milk monitor when you were at school?
No, Margaret Thatcher took away our milk.
Did they?
Yeah.
Well,
do you not know that? Thatcher, you're far too young.
I don't even know what a milk monitor is. What is a milk monitor?
Snatcher. We used to have free milk.
Sure,
free milk, you'd have a little mini bottle
I
of
know
milk.
that, but what's a milk monitor?
The person making sure you didn't steal 2 bottles of milk.
Right.
It's the same way of any monitor.
Okay.
I bet, actually, they're all too young.
So before my time.
It is. I grant you. Thatcher milk snatch. Actually, I was at private school, so I think we carried on.
Did you get milk at
We carried on
school?
Having milk, actually.
You probably did, yeah.
Long after Margaret Thatcher, probably still get it, in fact.
God, how the other half live.
Isn't it? Right, free milk. Natasha Clark, thank you so much. It's coming up to 12:30. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. A couple of interesting interviews for you on the way. It's becoming a rather gratifying tradition on Wednesdays. We need to have a proper look at sanctions, and who better to look at sanctions against Russia as the situation in Ukraine worsens from a Ukrainian perspective. Who better to help us in that field than our old friend Bill Browder, who's been at the front line, both of highlighting the criminality, of course, and worse, of Vladimir Putin's regime, but also of the financial impact that sanctions could have, with ripple effects moving everywhere. And then a really interesting guy who is essentially the scientist behind the medical technology that is delivering these new miracle drugs that look set to not just help with obesity, but also heart disease and dementia, even perhaps addiction. And the story of how this journey began and is unfolding is just riveting. I'm not going to lie to you. I heard it somewhere else and I thought, well, crikey, my listeners deserve to hear this as well. So shortly after 12:45 today, you will.
James O'Brien on LBC. Listen on your smart speaker. Just say, play LBC.
It is 12:34. I'm not invoking the curse of O'Brien because I am about to say something vaguely positive about a Conservative politician, albeit not one currently in government. But Tobias Ellwood took a lot of ribbing yesterday after posting a photograph of the new head of Russia's military, effectively in a uniform that had actually been cut and pasted from the rather brilliant Armando Iannucci film, The Death of Stalin, and the subject of the comedy was all the ludicrous medals. He almost looked like a member of the British royal family. He was wearing so many medals that he'd done nothing to earn. And unfortunately, that withdrew attention from Tobias Ellwood's central point, which was that someone who doesn't have a military background but has instead an economic background has now been put in charge of Russia's military, which is a very important point and speaks to how the country, by putting defence procurement as almost the country's top priority, moving ever further to a full war footing is something which, if this government were not so concerned with lanyards and the sex education of 9-year-old children, this government should be pretty bloody worried about. But despite Tobias Ellwood's best efforts yesterday, it is arguably not worried enough. And that is a theme that Bill Browder has also taken up from a slightly different angle. Bill, you will know if you listen to this programme, and indeed many others, is the head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign, who has been campaigning for years now for financial penalties to be brought against Vladimir Putin's plutocracy long before the invasion of Ukraine. And Bill was before the Commons Treasury Select Committee yesterday because there's a pincer movement here, Bill. On the one hand, it looks as if Russia is prioritising defence procurement above everything else. And on the other, the things that we were supposed to be doing on this side of the world to hamper that process and to stymie the financial side of the Putin regime is not going as well as you might have hoped.
Yeah, I mean, essentially what we have going on here is there's two fronts to the war. There's the actual shooting front, the guns and bombs and missiles, and then there's the financial front. And what's happened is that Ukraine is weaker on the financial front and the military front than Russia, and the only way that they can survive is with our help. And what we've seen in the last year or so is the U.S. withheld for 6 months $61 billion of military aid to Ukraine because of a few people in the House of Representatives that didn't want it. Hungary held up EU funding for a number of weeks in the late last year, and Ukraine is suffering. And there's going to be more of this because Putin, as you've just rightly pointed out, has got some. He will use all the money he has. He'll take money away from everybody else in order to fight this war. And he's got more staying power than we do. And that was one of the my main objective in front of the Treasury Select Committee was to talk about confiscating $300 billion of Russian money, which has been frozen since the beginning of the war, and giving that to Ukraine, because that would even the balance and that would give the Ukrainians a fighting chance at winning.
And this is something that you and Kira Riddick, of course, the Ukrainian politician, and many others have been calling for pretty much since Russian boot landed on Ukrainian soil. What are I don't know, this is a more complicated question than the time we have together allows you to answer in full, but what are the main sort of headline reasons, under your understanding, as to why this hasn't happened? Why what strikes many of us as not just good politics, but also natural justice hasn't happened?
Yeah, well, let's first just say the reasons why it should happen, which is that Putin has caused somewhere between 500 and a billion. $500 billion and $1 trillion worth of damage to Ukraine. He's launched an illegal war of aggression, and under international law, he should pay for that. That's the simple legal, moral, and political reason why it should happen. But then you have all sorts of people running around, flapping around, I should say, saying things like, "Oh my God, the financial system is going to come to an end if this happens." Oh my God, it's not legal. We can't do that. And other arguments like that, and my response to that, and I said this very clearly in the Treasury Select Committee yesterday, is that the world will not come to an end. There is the only people that have to worry about having money confiscated are countries that launch illegal wars of invasion, where they destroy hundreds of billions of dollars of property of their neighbors. Then they do have to worry, and there's actually one country that has the potential to do that. That's got a lot of foreign exchange reserves, and that's China. And so I think one of the best consequences of this is that China may be looking at this and saying, well, actually, we don't have our money confiscated that's being held in central banks around the world. In terms of the counter argument about, is this legal? Well, to the extent that there's any legal ambiguity, and there is some, that Russia can say that these are sovereign reserves that are protected by sovereign immunity like their embassy. The way you can deal with that is by passing laws. And that's why I was in Parliament yesterday among lawmakers to say, why don't you, like the Americans, just pass the law to say that if there's a conflict between two laws, one is the law that you're not allowed to destroy your neighbor's property, and the second, so that's the law, the money is protected by sovereign immunity, pass a law to say that in situations like this, that the law of not destroying your neighbor prevails, and that could be easily done in Parliament, and then there is no legal ambiguity. But most importantly, and this is something that I really should, and it's thank you for having me on your show, because I want to say this to all your listeners, is that whose money is more important, the British taxpayers' money who are going to have to pay for this stuff, or Putin's money? And I would say that there's not a single person listening to this who would want to pay for this before Putin pays for it. And we have his money frozen, which we can confiscate.
Let me nudge you now. I suppose both. Some people might answer if they were feeling mischievous. We could take Putin's money and spend some of our money as well, and then hopefully speed up the process of Ukraine repelling the Russian invasion even more so. But it's also the failure of the sanctions that we've already got in place that's moved front and centre, both as a consequence and before your appearance before the Treasury Select Committee. It sits alongside some work by Ed Conway at Sky News back in February about British companies still exporting hundreds of millions of pounds of equipment and machinery, which almost certainly ends up in Russia. How big? And Harriet Baldwin, the Conservative chair of the committee, has spoken about how sanctions are failing to hamper Russia's economy. I was surprised to read the IMF forecasting it's going to be one of the strongest economies this year. That's arguably an even bigger problem, isn't it, than the funding of the Ukrainian defences?
Well, first of all, we shouldn't believe the numbers that come out of Russia to be the truth. Russia lies at every step of the way. They pass it off to the IMF. They put their imprimatur on it, and everyone says, "Oh my God, look how good the Russian economy is doing." That's not the case. Russian economy is suffering very, very profoundly. But you're right. There is sanctions evasion that's happening on a regular basis. One of the things that bothers me the most, and I think it's one of the most important things, is that Russia continues to sell oil into the international markets. They get between $500 million and $1 billion a day from the sale of their oil. And they sell it to Indian, Turkish, and Chinese refineries. And then guess who those refineries sell the refined product back to? Us. Us. Here in the UK and in Europe, we're buying. So we're basically indirectly sending money to Russia so that they can buy bombs to kill Ukrainians. And then we're sending money to the Ukrainians to fight back on the Russians.
Is that partly because of the pressure that's put on Western governments by energy costs? I mean, are people looking the other way because the alternative would be to have ever higher energy costs here?
Well, that's the reason why we can't embargo Russian oil outright.
Yeah.
But there's no reason why we should be buying refined products from an Indian refinery that's buying Russian oil and then selling it back to us. I think that we can easily say, this stuff is all fungible. We'll buy it from somewhere else.
We won't take that. Yeah.
And
the price cap's not working either, is it really, Bill? The US-led oil price cap on Russia's oil sales.
Absolutely not. It's not working at all. Russia's making a lot of money from their oil sales. And so that's the huge loophole. That's the elephant in the room. That's what has to be dealt with, because it doesn't mean that Russia can't export their oil, but we don't want them to make any money off their oil exports. And if we make it all contentious and difficult and clog up their system, hopefully they get less money and they have less money to spend on this war.
How many? Focus on Britain, and I know you're not really in the business of speculation, but how many British companies would have consciously dirty hands in some of the processes that we're talking about, not just with oil, but in the failure of sanctions, in the exporting of equipment and machinery that might be ending up in people still doing business? Because I can sometimes read about fancy handbags, but I'm more interested in the less glamorous core. How many British interests would be actively working against the process of sanctioning Vladimir Putin's Russia?
Well, I don't have an exact number,
no,
but definitely some. And the one that sort of stands out is BP. BP said that they were going to withdraw from Russia. They sold down a few projects here and there, but they still have this huge investment in Rosneft, the Russian oil company, the Russian state-owned oil company. And their shares in that investment has generated, according to numbers I've seen last year, $3 billion of profit. And so you can't there should be some type of windfall tax on BP to take that profit that they're making in Russia and use it for Ukraine or something similar. But we certainly can't have any of our companies making money in Russia, paying taxes in Russia. That's just can't be allowed to happen.
Final question. We catch up relatively regularly. Obviously, the conversation since the invasion of Ukraine has changed. The big picture is bleaker than it has been pretty much since the first shells were fired in the direction of Kyiv, I think, Bill.
Yep. Well, but one thing I should say is that everybody always exaggerates the good and exaggerates the bad. True. We all thought that the war was going to be lost in 3 days, and the Ukrainians bravely and valiantly fought back, and then they ended up regaining 52% of their territory, and then we thought, oh my God, they can just go for 100%, and they can get counteroffensive, and then it took a while for them to get their equipment, and the Russians dug in, and then that didn't work. And then we had this big delay on the $61 billion of aid, and they started running out of bullets and ammunition, and now the Russians are getting some advantage, and they're taking a few villages here and there. By no means should you count the Ukrainians out. I mean, they're literally fighting for their lives. If the Russians take over, the women get raped, the men get tortured, and the children get kidnapped, and any Ukrainian doesn't want that to happen. And they will, I remember when the first day of the invasion, the babushkas, the grannies were like loading up Molotov cocktails. Everybody's going to get involved in fighting off the Russians. They're not going to win in Ukraine, but there could be a lot of dead people between now and then.
And we could be doing a lot more to help, as you have highlighted in characteristically clear fashion. Bill Browder, thank you, head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign, who was speaking yesterday at the Commons Treasury Select Committee about these issues. It's just gone 12:47. Some good news next. I think we all need good news. These weight loss drugs that are potentially changing the world, certainly changing the medical world, and also changing individual worlds, given the impact that they may have on everything from diabetes to dementia. The tale of the scientists who have done most to bring them into the public space is a rather uplifting one, and we will speak to the head of that team, Jens Juul Holst, a professor at the Department of Biomedical Sciences at the University of Copenhagen, after this.
Leading Britain's conversation, LBC, with James O'Brien.
10-1 is the time. What's the opposite of a moral panic? I was thinking about this on the way into work this morning. So a moral panic is when, oh my God, something's happening and it's going to make everything awful. It's going to be the end of civilization as we know it, whether it's video games or whatever it may be. But in medical terms, every now and then something comes along which is portrayed more by the media than by the scientific community as a miracle drug. And yet, of course, as with moral panics, sometimes it might be accurate. And the response to weight loss drugs, such as, well, they become known as Ozempic and Wegovy, seems to get more exciting with almost every passing day. This week it was the news that they may help treat addiction and dementia and other conditions as well that re-propelled them into the news, which is why I thought it would be worthwhile digging back into the story. And do you know what? This is a bit of a personal position, but when you start looking for the roots of good things happening in the world or good ideas being implemented on populations, it's surprising how many roots lead back to Denmark and to Copenhagen in particular. On a completely different subject, we were of course talking about urban cycling yesterday, where they have led the way. But that has absolutely nothing to do with Jens Juul Holst, who is a professor at the Department of Biomedical Sciences at the University of Copenhagen, and more pertinently for our purposes today, is the scientist who sort of started this story. Although, Jens Juul, thank you for your time today, the story doesn't start with a search for a weight loss drug, does it?
No, it doesn't. It started quite differently, and many years ago, actually. That was when people didn't talk about type 2 diabetes very much, and also when we didn't have obesity to a major extent, at least not in Denmark. So what was on everybody's mind was duodenal ulcer disease, gastric ulcer disease. That's what everybody had, pain in the stomach. And so we were interested in that, and I was a young surgeon. I was working in a surgical department. We did operations for this duodenal ulcer disease, and some of our patients developed hypoglycemia, low blood glucose levels, after the operation. And this was clearly because they produced too much insulin. So we wondered, why is it? What factor from the gut is it that stimulates the insulin secretion in these individuals and then causes their hypoglycemia? And so we started to search for that rather systematically, really. And we found some cells in the intestinal epithelium, in the lining of the gut, and they would light up with an antibody against glucagon, and we thought that they were interesting, those cells. So we tried to find out what was in those cells, and it took about 10 years now. So around 1993, we had found out what it was. It was a peptide of 69 amino acids that contained glucagon, but it didn't work to stimulate insulin secretion. But it was clear that this was part of a precursor of and other hormones, a precursor of glucagon, of course, but also something else. And that's where we started looking for what was in the remaining part of this precursor molecule. And that's where there was a sequence there, which is now called GLP-1, glucagon-like peptide 1, which we then pulled out of intestinal extracts and put on a perfused pancreas that we had in our laboratory so that we could see whether it would stimulate insulin secretion, and it did. That's how it started.
This is a story that you're taking us back, I think, almost 50 years, aren't you? Or certainly 30 or 40 years. Can I ask you a silly question?
Please do.
How often in that period do you have a day at work which actually counts as a high five moment? Because it sounds like a really slow grind,
so it was even slower than that, because one thing was to identify a peptide that would stimulate insulin secretion. There were several peptides that could do that in those days. The idea was to try to see what you could use it for.
Right.
So everybody knew that type 2 diabetes, that they had a poor beta cells. I mean, the insulin cells, they were not good. They couldn't react to glucose, and there was no signs of any, repair mechanism that was possible. So it was not written in the stars that this new peptide would do anything like that. So we had to go the long way to try to find out what does this new peptide do, and we found out that it also had effects on glucose production in the liver via another hormone, and we found out that it also inhibited the emptying of the stomach, and we found out that it had a number of activities. In the end, we also found that it inhibited appetite and food intake, and now it began to be really interesting in spite of the suspicion that this wouldn't probably work.
Right.
So we started treating people with this. And that was the day in 1993 where we gave this as infusion into the blood vessels to people with diabetes, and found that we could completely normalize their blood glucose levels in 4 hours. That was a day of the high five, you could say.
Yes.
Because then we knew that we were onto something very, very special. But then came a lot of more problems. And the first problem was we then started to inject people with, simple subcutaneous injections with this peptide. And they didn't work, really. And the reason was that the peptide was destroyed in the body within minutes. So it couldn't be done that way. And you couldn't even give them more, higher doses, because then they started to puke all over the place. So that didn't work either. So we had to find out what was wrong. It turned out to be an enzyme called DPP4 that broke down the peptide. And then we found out that you could inhibit that enzyme. And that actually ended up in what we call the DPP4 inhibitors, sitagliptin, Januvia.
So that's another high five. That's exactly, 2 in 30 years. That's 2 in 20 or 30 years.
Yes, that's absolutely. But we could also stabilize the peptide itself, and we did that. And that worked also to some extent, but not enough. And that was because the kidneys also eliminate this new hormone, and so you have to do something about that. And that's where the pharmaceutical industry came into the picture.
Right.
Novo Nordisk, they had found out how to do this, how to prolong the activity of these peptides by adding a fatty acid chain to it. Then it would bind to albumin in the circulation, and then have a much longer half-life. So we went from 2 minutes to 1 hour, to 12 hours, I'm sorry.
Good Lord.
So it was a really radical change, and that was the liraglutide molecule that came on.
That's the sort of, apart from for people with diabetes whose lives you'd already transformed, this is where the ramifications, that the applications become almost infinite, and it's why, because of Novo Nordisk as the drugs company and its relationship with the Danish government, this is impacting not just upon obesity around the world, but also upon Denmark's actual economy. I mean, when you hopped over from surgery to academia, you couldn't even have dreamt of having an impact like this upon the world, could you?
No, not at all. It was not possible. Remember that on one hand, we had this idea, this experience that if you gave too much of the peptide, people would be feeling bad and they would have nausea and vomit and all that. So that had to be solved. And you had to have these long-acting molecules to be able to work with this at all. So it turned out that very, very slow scaling up of the dosing was the solution to the problem. And today, it takes half a year to get to the final dose of these agents. Gosh. And if you break that, then you will have the problems with the side effects. So that all of that had to be worked on and understood. And they had to do even longer acting versions of the molecule, the weekly ones. And all of that then took, very meticulous studies where you carefully look.
It's an incremental process. The world discovers it, and it looks like an overnight success, Jens Juul. But the world discovers it. But I think you've made it clear to us today that this is that most of the iceberg is under the ocean, isn't it?
Exactly.
I think exactly. You have a great gift for communication as well as for science. Clearly, I have to ask you finally how you feel about all the speculation that a Nobel Prize may be heading in the direction of yourself and your team.
You'll have to ask somebody in Stockholm about that, I think. I have absolutely no idea. I have nothing, there's no chance to think about that. But the discovery as such, of course, is a good one for this, because this really will help a lot of people, millions of people, and will be really, it has already transformed diabetes therapy very, very profoundly. And of course, it's the first time in history that we can treat obesity.
Yes.
So
it's incredible.
It is quite unusual.
A long way from that first moment when you saw this possibly on the horizon. It's been an absolute privilege to talk to you, Professor. Thank you so much for your time.
You're very
today.
welcome. You're very welcome. Thank you.
Jens Juul, host, a professor at the Department of Biomedical Sciences at the University of Copenhagen, and although he's clearly far too modest to ever say so himself, one of those scientists who is likely to go down in history as having changed the world. I told you it was a good story. That's it from me for another day. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can also, of course, pause and rewind live radio on the official LBC app. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. 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 Globalplayer.com.